Good evening, friends. Tonight, we're plunging into the murky, grime-covered depths of hygiene in the 1200s. And no, this isn't the romanticized version with soft lighting, scented oils, or fluffy towels. Far from it. This is real medieval hygiene, where clean was more of a loose concept than a daily goal. Bathing wasn't a private luxury, it was a public event, often shared with strangers, livestock, and whatever seasonal illness happened to be making the rounds. From questionable soaps to communal tubs and some shockingly creative hair care methods, things were different. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of strange, sleepy dive into history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fun to see who else is lying in bed wondering if people really used fermented urine as shampoo. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's quietly slip into tonight's rather pungent journey through the past. You wake before the light, not because of any bell, but because the chickens begin to stir and the frost has crept into your bones. The fire is barely embers, and your woolen shift smells faintly of smoke, sweat, and damp straw. It's laundry day, or rather, laundry week. Because in the life of a medieval peasant in the 1200s, washing clothes wasn't a casual task. It was an ordeal, a routine shaped by necessity, tradition, and the quiet calculations of survival. There was no soap as we know it. There were no washboards, no laundry powder, no wringer machines humming in the corner. For most peasants, cleaning garments was done by hand, with patience, and with materials that required labor just to obtain. The primary cleansing agent wasn't even something purchased. It was made from ash. The lye bucket sat behind the cottage, usually near the midden or by the kitchen wall. It was little more than a barrel or large wooden tub, sometimes patched, with iron hoops. Into this went ashes, carefully collected from the hearth, cooled and sifted to remove bits of charcoal or bone. Water, preferably rainwater, was poured in slowly, allowed to seep through the ash over hours or days, leaching out potassium carbonate to form a caustic alkaline solution known as lye. This lye was then used to soak clothes, but not just any clothes, only the ones that needed it most. The long undergarments, woolen hose, linen smocks, and sometimes the rare cotton cap or chemise that had absorbed too much body oil or begun to yellow at the edges. Outer garments were brushed, beaten, or aired out. Only what touched the skin most needed scrubbing. Clothing wasn't washed weekly. It wasn't even washed monthly. Always. The labor was too great, the weather too unreliable. Most peasants had just one or two changes of garments, and these were patched, mended, and worn threadbare. Washing meant risking the fabric. Too much. Scrubbing could tear it. Too much lye could weaken the weave. But when it had to be done, the women, and it was nearly always the women, gathered water, collected ashes, and prepared to soak, scrub, and rinse until their knuckles were raw. Lye was dangerous, too strong, and it could burn skin, too weak, and it wouldn't lift the grease or sweat. Experienced laundresses tested it by dipping a feather in the solution. If the feather dissolved slightly, it was strong enough. If it curled or vanished, it was too strong and had to be diluted. There was no measuring cup, no pH strips. Just observation, repetition, and the wisdom passed from mother to daughter. Once the lye was ready, garments were soaked, sometimes overnight. Then came the scrubbing, not on a board, but against a flat stone, often at the edge of a stream. Women knelt or crouched, lifting wet cloth, rubbing it with hands reddened from cold or from the sting of lye. They used knotted ropes or bundles of heather to beat the fabric, loosening dirt and odors. In some villages, a special place by the river was reserved for this, an unofficial wash station worn smooth by decades of rinsing. In others, it was a more private affair, done behind cottages or in a wooden trough filled with heated water, if wood could be spared for the fire. The rinsing was just as important. Too much lye left in the fabric could irritate the skin, especially for babies or older people with sores. But water was precious. Rainwater, collected in barrels, was preferred for its softness. Well water, if available, was used with caution. It might contain minerals that stained instead of cleaned, and hauling water was itself a burden, often done in heavy pails over uneven ground. Sometimes, after rinsing, garments were boiled in a cauldron. This helped whiten the fabric and kill lice, or fleas. The fire needed for this task meant the boiling was timed carefully, only when other meals didn't need cooking, or when extra fuel could be gathered. It was a balancing act of time, heat, and attention. Drying was easier in summer, when garments could be laid on hedges, over low stone walls, or across wooden frames in the sun. But in winter or wet seasons, things were harder. Clothes were hung near the hearth, stiffening as they dried in smoke. The smell lingered in the fabric, a mix of ash, wool, and wood smoke. Not unpleasant, just ordinary. The smell of clean, in a world where soap had not yet become common. For stubborn stains, different herbs or materials might be used. Sour milk helped lift some kinds of grime. Urine, saved in a separate pot, was used in some areas as a bleaching or cleaning agent, its ammonia content acting as a rudimentary chemical scrub. Dandelion, oxgall, or clay were also sometimes added, depending on local knowledge. Clothes that were particularly delicate or particularly soiled were prayed over. That is not an exaggeration. A woman might whisper a short Latin verse or trace a cross over the fabric before placing it in lye, asking that it not tear or fade. Superstition and ritual went hand in hand with practice, and once everything was done, the stones were scrubbed clean, the lye bucket was emptied into the dirt, and the rinsing water, now a milky grey, was poured into a ditch or used to water weeds far from the vegetable patch. Nothing was wasted. Even waste had its place. You might imagine the feeling of slipping into a clean shift afterward. Not crisp, not scented, not soft, but dry, less scratchy, less stiff. The seams didn't itch as much. The cloth felt lighter, and for a moment, under all the effort and silence and fatigue, there was comfort. Not luxury, not freshness, but a small reset in a cycle of labor. And sometimes, that was enough. Still, one wonders, when did cleanliness become something peasants longed for? And when did it become just one more chore in a life filled with dirt? The work was not finished when the clothes were scrubbed. Once the fabric was rinsed and wrung, it had to be dried and beaten flat. In the absence of flat irons or linen presses, peasants used wooden paddles or heavy sticks to thump folds into compliance. A stone slab or an upturned bench served as the makeshift surface, and the thumping could be heard echoing in the colder months, like a quiet, rhythmic drumbeat behind hedgerows and fences. Drying clothes in medieval villages was subject to as much unwritten etiquette as practical strategy. In summer, women laid their garments across meadows or on the long limbs of low apple trees. Children were often tasked with keeping crows away or flipping the clothes to help both sides dry evenly. These domestic landscapes filled with flapping. Tunics and bleached shifts were momentary exhibitions of a family's condition. A torn sleeve revealed a rushed repair. A linen tunic without patches spoke of either good fortune or recent dowry. But the social rules were clearer in villages. One did not spread garments too close to the church path, nor lay personal items on the Lord's stone fence. If drying space was short near the cottages, women might walk further out, to riverbanks or abandoned meadows where old tree stumps could be used as pegs and lines. These shared spaces required patience and sometimes negotiation. In the cold seasons, drying became far more complicated. Frost-stiffened garments were brought indoors and laid over chairs, bedposts, or near the hearth. The smoky air lent everything a faint scent of peat or alderwood. In wealthier peasant homes, those with separate cooking and sleeping quarters, clothes were hung in the rafters, away from stray embers and out of reach of the chickens. The problem wasn't just drying, but mildew. If clothing stayed damp too long, the faint scent of rot would cling to it, and once embedded in thick wool, it was almost impossible to remove. Rivers were a lifeline for washing, but they weren't always clean, nor always welcoming. In some places, designated washing stones were set into the shallows, smooth-faced slabs shaped by centuries of use. Women brought buckets, bundles, and long-handled tools for beating cloth against the current. But rivers were communal, and their use was regulated not only by custom, but increasingly in the later 1200s, by village charters or manorial rules. The upstream side was often reserved for drinking water collection, the downstream edge for waste. Washers had to find their place in the middle. In many communities, Washing days were fixed, once every 2 weeks or once a month, so that river access was managed. Disputes over who got the best stone, who soiled the stream, or who let lye runoff drift into fishing waters were not uncommon. Women might come early, before sunrise, to claim their spot. The washing became not only labour, but a kind of guarded performance, a visible assertion of cleanliness, domestic order, and quiet competitiveness. And not all washing happened in public. For undergarments and more intimate linens, many women washed at home, using smaller buckets and basins. They waited for dusk, or the cover of a quiet day when neighbours were away. Privacy mattered, even in villages where walls were thin and fences low. A woman's dignity, especially when poor, often rested in how she managed her family's laundry, not its grandeur, but its invisibility. Children were sometimes drawn into the process, not for scrubbing, but for fetching water, gathering firewood to heat rinse tubs, or hanging smaller cloths within reach. Boys and girls learned early that laundry day was not to be trifled with. There were no games when lye was boiling, no arguments near the hearth. The rhythms of domestic labour shaped the tempo of the household. Yet even among this seriousness, there were rituals of care. Some women placed herbs between folds of clean garments, lavender when it was in bloom, or crushed, rosemary wrapped in cloth, not for fragrance, but for what was believed to be protection. Scented herbs kept illness away, they said, or at least kept insects from nesting too soon. There was also the act of marking ownership. Clothes were expensive. Accidents and thefts were not unknown, especially in communal drying areas. To keep track, women stitched simple initials or unique knots into the corners of tunics and sheets. Not embroidery, not decoration, just quiet signals of whose hands had washed and mended these items. And when laundry was done, the tools themselves were cleaned. The lye bucket was rinsed and turned upside down to dry. Stones were scrubbed. Ropes were coiled and hung out of reach of dogs or children. The closing of laundry day came with a kind of calm exhaustion. Clothes hung from beams, steaming faintly in the warmth of the fire. The room smelled of ash and damp wool, but it was a familiar scent, a signal that work had been done. Not every household managed it. Some were too poor, too sick, or too overwhelmed by the seasons. In those cases, dirt accumulated. A child's shift might be worn for weeks until its colour faded into the earth. And still neighbours would understand. Cleanliness was admired, but not always possible. You can imagine the satisfaction of clean linen laid over a straw mattress, the faint herbal scent mingling with smoke, the stiff fabric slowly softening under the weight of a sleeping body. There were no perfumes, no flowered soaps, but there was effort. Repeated, generational effort. Scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, hands made rough so that garments could be soft. And yet, even with all that labour, one question remains. When everything smells of fire, ash and wool, how do you know what clean truly is? By the time the laundry was dry and folded, or rather rolled and bundled, as folding wasn't always practiced in a formal sense, it had become more than fabric. It was a statement, not just of tidiness or health, but of character. A clean shift said a woman had kept her home in order. A well-rinsed tunic suggested a household that managed its time and water with care. Dirt was not just a stain on cloth, it was a shadow on reputation. In the medieval village, where gossip travelled, faster than carts and reputations were built on the repetition of small deeds, cleanliness held quiet weight. Neighbours noticed. A wife whose husband's shirt was always damp with old sweat might be pitied or blamed. A girl seen drying underclothes on common fence rails might be whispered about. A child in a grimy tunic could be a sign of too many mouths and not enough bread, or of a mother who was slipping. Of course, the reverse was also true. A household whose linens hung regularly from the hedges, whose wool cloaks steamed freshly after the rains, whose buckets were scrubbed and stored properly. Such a home was thought to be orderly, reliable, strong. Cleanliness was not just comfort, it was credibility. In religious teachings of the period, the metaphor of washing extended beyond the physical. Priests spoke of the soul as a garment to be laundered, of confession as a kind of scrubbing away of spiritual filth. The Virgin Mary was often compared to a spotless cloth, unsullied by sin. These ideas seeped into daily habits. Women recited short prayers as they wrung out clothes. They asked for sins to be lifted like grease from linen. Piety mingled with practice, and ritual lived within repetition. Yet for all this, the church itself sometimes discouraged excessive attention to the body. There was a theological tension between cleanliness and vanity. Bathing, and by extension laundering, could be viewed with suspicion if done for the sake of appearance rather than health or morality. Monks wrote sternly about women who wore overly fragrant shifts, or men who sent their servants to the washhouse too frequently. Still, most peasants lived far from the doctrinal debates. They lived in the churn of mud and milk, among infants and aching backs. For them, cleanliness was not about pride. It was about functionality. A clean tunic itched less. A well-washed cloth could be wrapped around a wound. A rinsed sheet, warmed by the fire, offered better sleep. As the 1200s wore on, textile practices began to shift. The spread of linen cultivation meant that more households, especially in Northern Europe, had access to lighter, more washable fabrics. Water management improved in some regions. Small aqueducts or dug channels fed communal troughs, and better wells meant more rinsing water. In towns, washerwomen began to appear as semi-professional labourers, paid to launder clothes for wealthier households, often using shared facilities near rivers or bathhouses. These women, stooped, strong, and perpetually damp, became fixtures of medieval street life. Their hands were known for being cracked and red, their voices hoarse from calling over rushing water. They knew which soapwort was best, which wool could take boiling, and which stains had to be left alone. They were part of an emerging labour, class tied to hygiene, even if they were never thanked for it. Among the peasants, though, laundering remained family work, shared among sisters, mothers and daughters, passed down in gesture and muscle memory. A child learned to carry the pail before she could pronounce the word clean. Boys watched their grandmothers stretch wool over drying racks before they ever held a plough, and when illness came, as it often did, laundry took on new urgency. Blankets were rinsed more often, garments scorched in hot water, floors scrubbed, with lye, not always because it helped, but because it was something to do, an act of control in a world of unknowns. Afterward, in the quiet of the evening, after all was washed and put away, the tools cleaned and stacked, the hands rubbed with grease or wrapped in cloth, there was a stillness. A room scented with ash, linen, and air. A pause. A moment where the labour ended and the living began again. Slightly lighter for the work done. Clothes were never completely clean. Dirt returned. Ash smeared. Water dried too slowly. But each act of laundering delayed the inevitable decay. It was not about perfection. It was about rhythm, about the steady insistence that things could, for a while, be made better. And so, you might ask, in a world that churned with dust, toil and noise, was the act of washing not simply about cleanliness, but a quiet kind of hope? You sit at the edge of the wooden tub, toes curling at the bottom, where the water has already turned lukewarm. Your shift lies in a heap nearby, along with the linen you use to dry yourself. A single tallow candle flickers in the far corner of the room, casting long shadows on the daub and wattle wall. This is your bath, your seasonal plunge. And though it may not resemble anything from a noble estate or holy cloister, it is as clean as life will get this quarter. Bathing for the medieval peasant was not a weekly affair. It was rarely even monthly. Instead, it was a seasonal ritual, sometimes observed more out of obligation than comfort. The reasons were many: cold weather, lack of privacy, scarcity of clean water, and the ever-looming fear of illness. But when the time came, before major feasts, holy days, weddings, or the beginning of harvest, bathing was done with care, caution, and no small amount of effort. A bath required more than just water. It needed fuel. Heating enough water to fill even a small wooden tub meant lighting a fire, keeping it stoked, and hauling bucket after bucket from the well or the rain barrel. If the household had livestock, their needs came first. Only after the animals were fed and the cooking was complete could the fire be turned over to warming bath water. Water might be perfumed lightly with herbs, sage, thyme, or chamomile, to help mask the mustiness of the wood or the slightly metallic tang of well-drawn liquid. But more often, it was just plain water, softened if possible, by allowing it to sit in a barrel for a few hours to let the silt settle. In summer, The sun could warm the barrel enough to make bathing slightly more pleasant. In winter, even heated water cooled too quickly. Tubs varied in size and shape. Some were half barrels repurposed from brewing or cider making. Others were specially made, narrow wooden cylinders bound with iron hoops. In households that lacked tubs, people washed standing up in basins, pouring water over themselves from ladles or wooden dippers. A full immersion was rare and considered a luxury. Bathing was not done naked if others were nearby. Men and women bathed in long shifts or underclothes, especially if the washing happened outdoors or in communal situations. Modesty was not an afterthought, it was a social guardrail. Even married couples often bathed separately unless privacy allowed otherwise. And in homes with multiple generations under one roof, privacy was hard won. In villages with access to rivers or ponds, outdoor bathing was more common during the warm months. Children were often sent to wash in shallow streams, with instructions not to wander too far. Women would kneel at the edge, using cloths to scrub their arms and legs, while keeping an eye on livestock or younger siblings. The river was never just a river. It was a thread that tied together cleanliness, work, and community. But public bathing was not always safe. In some places, the riverbanks were watched closely. Straying too far downstream could mean venturing into rougher currents, or lands owned by others. Accusations of impropriety were not uncommon, especially for women bathing alone. And while the river cleansed, it also carried runoff from households, farms, and livestock. A careless scrape could lead to infection. Bathhouses, where they existed, were usually found in towns rather than rural hamlets. These were communal spaces, sometimes operated by religious institutions, sometimes privately managed, where individuals paid a fee for access to hot water, steam, and in some cases, companionship. Peasant families rarely visited these places, unless traveling, and even then, only the better off among them could afford it. For those who did bathe at home, the process followed a careful order. The face and hands were washed first, then the arms, neck, and torso. Legs and feet came last. Hair was usually washed less frequently, perhaps only once or twice a year, using lye soap or crushed herbs mixed with water. Combs were used to remove lice and tangles before washing, not after. Children were bathed under watchful eyes, often sharing water in succession. Babies might be washed more often, but even this was tempered by fears that too much bathing could weaken them. Elderly villagers, meanwhile, were less likely to bathe at all, especially in colder seasons. For them, comfort outweighed cleanliness. When the bath was done, the water was poured out into the garden or onto paths where it could soak harmlessly into the ground. Towels, if available, were rough linens reused for years. And then the body, damp, pink, and still steaming, was wrapped in a clean shift or blanket and brought near the fire, not to rest, but to return to the work of daily life. Cleanliness was fleeting. The floor was dirt. The roof leaked. Animals wandered inside. The smoke from the fire clung to skin and hair, returning quickly the very scents that had been washed away. Yet there was a sense of renewal, however brief. You could smell the change. You could feel it in the way your shirt stuck less to your shoulders, or how the itching on your scalp eased for a day or two. And for that short window, the world felt slightly more bearable. Still, one question lingers. In a life so full of dirt, sweat, and repetition, what made bathing feel like a ritual rather than just another chore? Bathing, as you now know, was not a frequent act for the medieval peasant. But when it happened, it was not always solitary. In fact, under certain conditions, it could become communal, not just in a literal sense, but in a social one. The act of bathing might unfold in layers of etiquette, observation, and subtle judgment. While the tub may have held just one or two at a time, the meaning of the act rippled outward, like the wash water itself. In some larger villages and hamlets near monasteries or market towns, communal bath days emerged out of shared necessity. A neighbor with a large cauldron or sturdy tub might invite others to bathe in turn. These arrangements were unspoken agreements built on trust, reciprocity, and practicality. You might carry your own soap, a hard, pale lump made from lye and rendered animal fat, or a bundle of herbs, but the heat and water were shared. Women bathed with women, men with men. Children often scrubbed together while their mothers watched from nearby. In some regions, such as parts of Germany and the Low Countries, these practices became semi-ritualized. Communal bathhouses even appeared in some towns by the 12th and 13th centuries. While urban establishments often drew suspicion for mixing genders and encouraging less than virtuous behavior, rural bath gatherings were more constrained by familiarity and reputation. They were not events of pleasure or flirtation. They were survival strategies marked by discipline. And yet, even here, suspicion lingered. Bathing was often accompanied by rules, some spoken, others merely understood. You did not gossip while in the bath. You did not stare too long. You did not let your water sit too long in the tub without sharing it. Water had to move. Cleanliness was not only about removing dirt, but about maintaining balance. Stillness was stagnation, in water and in social behavior. Beyond the practical, bathing was surrounded by superstition. In many villages, certain times of year were avoided entirely. Bathing too close to midsummer might expose the body to harmful spirits. Washing during a thunderstorm was considered unlucky, and no one, absolutely no one, washed themselves on the eve of St. John's Day without first sprinkling protective herbs into the water. Fennel, rue, or verbena might be tossed in to ward off illness or envy. The fear of opening pores was real. Healers and midwives cautioned that warm water could weaken the body's natural defenses, leaving it vulnerable to illness. After a bath, people bundled up, even in summer. The body was opened after washing, and cold air might slip in, inviting fever. For this reason, many believed that bathing too often did more harm than good. Cleanliness, in the wrong context, could court disaster. Despite these warnings, the desire to feel clean, to truly feel clean, persisted. A new shift, scrubbed skin, hair combed with oil and left to dry in the sun. This was a rare pleasure, not vanity, but a brief peace. A man might find his back pain eased by the warmth of a soak. A woman, hunched from the endless labor of the field, might feel her hands loosen after scrubbing herself by firelight. There were other signs that a person had bathed. Their hair was slightly damp the next morning. Their nails no longer bore soil. Their scent, though never what modern noses would call fresh, lacked the musk of fieldwork. People noticed. They complimented, subtly. A neighbor might say, "You've slept well, it seems," or "The air agrees with you." These were quiet nods to the act of bathing without naming it aloud. Bathing had its own economy too. Some traded herbs or fat for lye soap. Others borrowed buckets or hauled water in exchange for time at someone's fire. Children offered to fetch kindling in return for the chance to bathe in warmed water rather than cold river runoff. The bath was not free, even in a world without coins for such things. And when you stepped from the water, body tingling, skin blotched from the scrub, you did not linger. Towels were scarce, drying spaces tighter still. A shift was pulled on quickly. Wet garments hung near the hearth, and your hair, if long, was plaited or twisted to dry. In some homes, women sat in silence afterward, sipping warm broth or drying, their hands by the coals. The bath was over. The body had been made new for a while. Soon enough, dirt would return. So would sweat, the sticky trace of wool against skin, and the film of labor that no soap could quite prevent. But for a single day, perhaps two, you could feel a difference. And others could too. Still, even among these small comforts, one question drifts quietly through time. If the feeling of being clean was so fleeting, why did it still matter so much? The warmth from the bath lingers in your limbs, even after the shift has been pulled over your head and the drying cloth has been wrung out and hung near the hearth. There is no perfume, no soft towel, no glass mirror to confirm the difference, but you feel it. A clarity at the back of the neck, a looseness behind the knees. The invisible weight of grime has lifted, and in its place is something else. Lightness, or maybe memory. The memory of what it feels like to be clean is perhaps the most elusive and enduring part of bathing. For medieval peasants, cleanliness was rarely sustained for long, but the act itself carried symbolic weight. It was a reset, a marking of time, a declaration to the body and the home that another phase of life had begun, a new planting season, a feast day, a wedding, or a birth. The rare occasions when peasants bathed were often tied not to routine, but to rhythm. Events demanded cleanliness. A girl preparing to marry would be scrubbed from head to toe. her hair combed with oil and plaited tightly, her garments fresh from a long soak in lye and rinsed in rainwater. A young man bound for service might bathe before leaving home, standing, awkwardly, in a corner tub while his mother murmured prayers and fetched water. An infant's first bath was performed with solemn care, often with godparents present, and the water from that ritual was sometimes poured near a threshold or buried beneath a tree. Even death had its washing. Bodies were cleaned and prepared, with the same care as a feast guest. Women of the village would gather in silence to wipe limbs, braid hair, and clean the nails. Soap, herbs, and cloths were used sparingly, but the intent mattered more than the materials. The dead were carried to rest as clean as the living could make them. These moments added to the emotional economy of cleanliness. Being clean was not only about hygiene. It was about respect, readiness, transition. It was a signal that something was beginning or ending. And yet for all this, bathing also revealed the class line. The noble could afford private rooms for bathing, imported soaps, heated tiles, attendants. In the manorial estates or religious houses, bath nights might be more regular, with wooden tubs brought indoors, linen towels refreshed, and ointments applied. The peasant, by contrast, reused the same wood tub, mended it with pitch, and ladled water over their shoulders from a shared basin. When a peasant was clean, it was often despite hardship, not because of indulgence. That divide was visible. A traveller walking into a village could identify the recently washed by their posture, their gait, the calm around their eyes. For peasants, even a single bath could soften the face. It made people pause before returning to labour, not because they felt grand, but because they remembered, just briefly, that they had a body worth tending. Children responded to it too. A freshly washed child might cry at first, the heat and rough cloth a shock, but would sleep longer that night. And mothers noticed. They held their babies longer, tucked them in with more care, kissed their clean foreheads with a kind of silent satisfaction. Not for purity, not for piety, but for peace. There were challenges, of course. After bathing, lice returned. Dirt from the fields stuck to damp feet. Sweat soaked the tunic within hours. The fire smoked. The air dried skin. And soon, the memory of the bath was all that remained. But it was a memory people clung to. They repeated it aloud. I bathed before Michaelmas. She was fresh on her wedding day. We soaked her. Feet before the harvest feast. These recollections carried meaning in their sheer rarity. And then there was the silence that followed. After the rinsing and the drying and the putting away of cloths, a quiet settled over the household. People sat close to the fire, not speaking much, their hands wrapped around cups, their bodies tired in a new way. It was a different kind of fatigue, not the weariness of the field, but the loosening that comes after shedding something old. You slept better that night, not because you were cleaner necessarily, but because you had paused, because the water, though drawn from the same barrel, had passed over you and taken something with it. A weight, a staleness, a slowness of spirit, and you woke the next morning to the same work, the same clothes, the same soil, but your mind held the trace of it. The bath, the water, the hush. For a short while, you remembered. Still, you might wonder, if the feeling fades so quickly, does the memory of being clean matter more than the cleanliness itself? You wake with the sun and dress quickly. Your tunic is the same one you wore yesterday and the day before that. The wool is coarse but warm, and though the seams have held through another season, the smell of smoke, sweat, and soil lingers in. Its folds. You lean over the low table near the hearth, where a small bundle of dried sage leaves lies wrapped in old linen. You rub a leaf between your palms and press the powdery scent into the hollows beneath your arms. This is how the day begins, not with soap, but with herbs. In the 1200s, a peasant's relationship with odor was not shaped by modern ideas of hygiene or freshness. Scent was natural, unavoidable, and often layered. The base notes were always the same: animals, firewood, earth, wool, and the faint sour tang of sweat. But what a person smelled like could still be adjusted, modified, not to please the nose necessarily, but to protect the body, the soul, and sometimes the social order. Herbs played a central role in this daily act of invisible resistance. In the absence of soap, deodorant, or perfume. Peasants turned to the garden, the forest, and the hedgerows to gather what they believed could balance the body's smells and humours. Sage, rosemary, thyme, garlic, lavender, and even crushed marjoram were among the most favoured. These were not luxury scents, they were practical tools. They were used not to dazzle, but to defend. Sage, for example, was thought to ward off illness and calm the blood. A few dried leaves tucked into a linen pouch and pinned beneath the tunic might help absorb odour and sweat. Rosemary was stronger, pungent, resinous. Women boiled its stems and let the scent rise with the steam, letting it fill the cloths they used to wipe their faces. Garlic, though less pleasant to modern sensibilities, was deeply respected. It was warming, purifying, and strong, enough to keep both insects and spirits away. Rubbing a clove under the arms was not uncommon, especially in the warmer months when bodies sweated more freely. These herbs were often stored in bundles, tied with twine, wrapped in old cloth, hung near windows or from roof beams. In some homes, the herbal cabinet was a simple box beneath the bed, or a sack tucked behind the hearth. Mothers taught daughters when to gather and how to dry each plant. Boys learned to identify rosemary by its bitter snap, and to avoid angelica unless told. Otherwise, every herb had its time and place, its mood and meaning. The peasant nose, used to layers of scent, was keen. People noticed changes. A husband might pause if his wife smelled more strongly of lavender than usual. It could mean she was preparing for a feast, or that she had visited another woman's hearth for something more than herbs. A child coming home with the scent of mugwort on his sleeves might be suspected of walking too close to the woods, or of picking plants meant for other purposes. Sometimes, herbs were burned. A bundle of dried thyme or rue could be tossed into the hearth to scent the air, especially after illness or childbirth. The smoke was thought to cleanse, not just the room, but the spirit. In rare cases, villagers carried small herb-filled pouches on strings around their necks, not for fashion, but for defense. These were known as posies, or herb charms, and they were believed to keep away foul air, miasma, that invisible, threat said to bring plague or fever. Even beds had their own herbal scents. Fresh straw was sometimes mixed with chamomile or mint to ease sleep. Fleas and lice were ever present, and the scent of wormwood or tansy could discourage them, if only for a little while. Clean sheets were a luxury, but a handful of herbs scattered between the straw could suggest care, even comfort. These traditions were often deeply personal. One woman might favour lavender because her mother did. Another might rely only on garlic, swearing it kept her from taking sick in the winter. Families passed down not just recipes, but rituals. A specific way to crush sage, a prayer to murmur, while rubbing rosemary oil into the scalp. A rule about never mixing basil with rue. These were rules unwritten, but firmly held, and for all their practicality, there was still a trace of beauty in it. A girl brushing her hair and combing rosemary oil through the ends. A man rolling his sleeves and rubbing thyme between his wrists before walking to market. These gestures, small and private, echoed the human desire to feel presentable, even when the world did not require it. But there was always a question beneath it all. Were the herbs for the body or for the soul? You walk the narrow path between two huts, the late sun slanting through bundles of drying lavender that hang from the rafters. In one hand, you carry a scrap of linen tied with twine. Inside it are crushed leaves, a blend of rosemary and dried sage. You're headed toward the home of the herb wife, not because you're ill, but because you've noticed the scent on your tunic growing thicker, more sour. You don't name it aloud, but you hope she has something stronger. In the medieval village, not everyone gathered herbs in the same way. While most households grew or foraged basic plants, there was always someone, usually a woman, who knew more. The herb wife was a fixture in many communities. She kept bundles sorted by use, drying agents, perfumes, medicinals, and those that straddled all three. She dried her plants in rows across the rafters, hung them in closets, and steeped the more precious ones in oils or animal fats. People came to her not just for treatment, but for advice, for whispers, and for that strange half-belief that she might know what the body needed before it asked aloud. She knew which scents lasted longest under wool, Which ones masked smoke better than sweat, which could be tucked into bedding to keep lice away. She also knew the rituals. The days when rosemary picked before dawn would hold its scent longer, or how sage gathered during a waxing moon was stronger in the bath water. Her knowledge was built from observation, repetition, and the quiet memory of dozens of women before her. Herbs had many lives in this world. A single plant could serve three purposes: cosmetic, curative, and protective. Sage rubbed on the armpits for odor might also soothe a sore throat when steeped in hot water. Thyme used in oil for scent could be burned as fumigation after childbirth. Garlic mashed and rubbed on the soles of feet was not just a strong-smelling practice, but a ward against chill and spirits. And these spirits weren't mere superstition to the peasant mind. Illness was often believed to be caused by corrupted air, miasma, or the influence of unseen forces. Scent, then, was not just pleasure or propriety, it was armor. If you could change how you smelled, you could change what noticed you, or what passed you by. Garlic stung the nostrils, rue made your eyes water, but the stronger the herb, the more likely it was to drive off what didn't belong. Certain people were known by scent alone. A child who smelled of mugwort was likely from a family that feared night fevers. A man who reeked faintly of tansy might have recently buried someone. A woman who wore the sweetness of marjoram might be expecting, or trying to. These were unspoken codes, olfactory signs read and filed away, especially by older women, who often remembered more through scent than sight. And still, the association of herbs with sin lingered. Some clergy frowned upon those who sought too many herbs. Anointing oneself with rosemary too frequently was considered vanity. Hanging posies around the home could be viewed as distrust in God's protection. But even the sternest priest could not fully separate the sacred from the scented. Churches themselves were filled with the smell of incense, another kind of herb, burned for purification. And monastery gardens were full of the very same plants peasants rubbed on their wrists. You were expected to know when enough was enough, to smell clean, but not indulgent, to perfume your space lightly, but not extravagantly, to use herbs in a way that showed care, not obsession. Back at the herb wife's hut, she hands you a new pouch. Inside are dried bay leaves and a scrap of linen infused with rosemary and ox fat, rubbed together in slow circles and cured by her fire. This'll last 3 days, maybe more, she says, pressing it into your hand. You thank her with a nod. Leave a piece of cheese in exchange and tuck the pouch into the inside of your tunic. Already, you can feel its warmth. Later, when you pass others on your way home, they glance at you only briefly. No one speaks of your smell, but they notice. And in a village where words are scarce and memory long, that quiet recognition is enough. Still, you might wonder, were these herbs truly for keeping others away? Or were they really meant to keep something deeper inside you safe? The pouch from the herb wife has done its work. For a day or two, maybe 3, your tunic smells faintly less like wool and more like the hedgerow after rain. The rosemary lingers in the folds near your shoulders. The fat has stained the linen, slightly, but you don't mind. The scent makes you feel a little more human, less like a walking field. But you know it will fade. It always does. Peasants lived in a world of changing scent, unlike the perfumed courts of nobility, where layers of expensive oils might mask the absence of water. The peasant strategy was about masking and managing what could not be washed away. No soap could undo hours spent digging ditches or bending over grain sacks. No sprig of thyme could truly outmatch the acrid sting of manure or fire smoke. But still, they tried. Because scent, though fleeting, could offer dignity. Over time, the use of herbs became more than a habit. It became a form of self-recognition. A woman might crush dried marjoram into her hair every time she braided it, not because it changed how others saw her, but because it made her feel herself. A man might press sage leaves into the soles of his boots before setting out to walk to a neighboring village, not for the road's sake, but because it reminded him of home. These quiet acts of maintenance were a resistance against being reduced to function. In a world where peasants were often seen as tools, laborers for the manor, hands for the harvest, herbs became a way to reassert individuality. To rub rosemary oil on your skin was to say, in the smallest of voices, I am not only a backbent in a field, and there was also memory in scent. The smell of lavender might recall a summer long past when the bloom had been particularly full. The sharpness of crushed garlic might bring back the image of a grandmother's hands, rubbing it on your feet when you had a fever as a child. The scent of wormwood, so bitter and earthy, could call to mind that day you dug the root from under the hedgerow with your sister, laughing when it clung to the soil like a stubborn old tooth. Even those who did not have their own gardens could carry scent. Market days offered sprigs of dried herbs bundled in tight twists of cloth. Children sometimes chewed on sweet-smelling stalks to freshen their mouths before feast days. And during celebrations, garlands were made from the most fragrant plants available, not to impress, but to feel part of something seasonal, cyclical, alive. In time, even after herbs had dried, crumbled, and fallen from favor, their rituals remained. You might not always have rosemary, but you remember the motion of rubbing your palms together, warming the oil between them, and pressing the scent into your clothes. You remember your mother's touch as she pulled your shirt away from your neck and smeared garlic oil on your collarbones before sending you to tend the goats. You remember the sweetness of mint, not just in the smell, but in the fact that someone took the time to gather it for you. As years pass and habits shift, as children grow and forget, the memory of scent becomes harder to summon. But something lingers, perhaps not the fragrance itself, but the moment it created. The moment someone paused, prepared a pouch, handed you something meant to help. Eventually, the pouch you received from the herb wife is empty. The scent is gone. You could toss it away, but instead, you hang it near your bedding, not for function, but for remembrance. You inhale once more, eyes closed, trying to capture the last trace of rosemary. And perhaps you ask yourself, is the smell we remember ever truly gone, or do we carry it somewhere deeper than the nose can reach? The morning begins, as it always does, with breath and silence. You rise, pull on your tunic, and reach for the thin strip of linen by the hearth. It is not fresh, but it is yours. You wrap it around a finger, dip it into a small bowl of cold water steeped overnight with crushed mint, and begin rubbing your teeth, gently, one by one. You spit into the ashes beside the fire. This is how the day starts, not with a rinse or a paste, but with a cloth and a habit born of routine rather than science. In the 1200s, the idea of oral hygiene was very different from what it would later become. There were no toothbrushes in the modern sense, no toothpaste squeezed from tubes, no professional cleanings, but there was care, thoughtful, consistent, and guided by observation. Medieval peasants, despite the grime of their lives, did not ignore their teeth. They knew the pain of rot, the danger of infection, and the embarrassment of foul breath. They acted with what they had, and sometimes they acted with surprising effectiveness. The most common tool for cleaning the mouth was a tooth wipe. These were strips of old cloth, usually linen, wrapped around a finger or knotted at the end to create texture. They were used dry, damp, or soaked in herbal solutions, and rubbed along the teeth, gums, and tongue to remove food, plaque, and the taste of sleep. Some were reused for weeks, hung by the hearth to dry at night. Others were shared among family members, though this was more common among children. Chewing sticks were also widely used. A small branch, trimmed to the length of a hand, was chewed at one end until it frayed into fibers. The type of wood mattered. Hazel, ash, and birch were favorites for their mild astringency and pliability. The frayed end was then used like a brush swept along the teeth and between them. Some added charcoal or salt to the wood before chewing. Others dipped the sticks in herbal infusions or wrapped them in mint leaves for a fresher scent. Charcoal was not just for fires. Ground finely, it became a crude powder for scrubbing. It absorbed odor, polished the teeth, and left behind a faint, earthy taste. Mixed with salt, it formed a kind of medieval tooth powder. Peasants might keep a small bowl of it near the hearth, dipping cloth or stick into it before cleaning. The gritty texture could be harsh, but the results, whiter, smoother teeth, were enough to make it worth the effort. Herbs once again came into play. Mint, sage, fennel, and horehound were chewed raw, steeped in water for rinses, or boiled with vinegar for a mouthwash of sorts. Garlic, despite its sharp odor, was believed to strengthen the gums when applied carefully, and cloves were prized for their numbing properties when toothache struck. A single clove, pressed against a painful molar, might offer hours of relief. Toothpicks, made from bone or wood, were common at meals. They were not decorative, but functional, used quickly and without ceremony to clear food from between teeth. In households where dental pain was frequent, a thin sliver of iron or a splintered reed might also be kept on hand for probing or even digging. These were dangerous tools, and infections were common. But without other recourse, people took the risk. And then there were the remedies: honey mixed with vinegar and herbs for swollen gums, ash rubbed into the teeth for polishing, a poultice of crushed plantain leaf applied to the cheek for jaw pain. The remedies were as varied as the illnesses, and passed down from mouth to mouth, woman to daughter, elder to apprentice. If the pain grew too great, if rot took hold, there was only one solution left: removal. Teeth were pulled with tongs, wrapped in linen for grip, or extracted by travelling tooth pullers, men who carried iron tools and promised quick relief for a coin. Peasants often did it themselves or had a neighbour help, with a strong grip and a moment of silence before the sharp twist. There was no anaesthetic. Sometimes strong drink was offered, other times prayers, but not all peasants lost their teeth young. In fact, archaeological remains show many had surprisingly healthy mouths well into adulthood, especially compared to later centuries, when sugar grew more common. The medieval diet, while coarse and fibrous, was relatively low in refined sweeteners. Grains, root vegetables, salted meat, and dairy did not feed decay in the same way treacle and imported sweets would in centuries to come. So a peasant's smile, though perhaps crooked or yellowed, might have held most of its teeth. And maintaining that smile in a world of pain and poverty became an act of quiet care. Still, as you toss the used linen back to its place by the fire, the question remains: if no one saw your teeth but your family and your sheep, why bother keeping them clean at all? You chew on the end of a birch twig, feeling the fibers fray and soften against your molars. It tastes faintly green, with a bitter edge that lingers along your tongue. As the fibers spread, you run the stick gently across your back teeth. You're not thinking about appearance. You're thinking about the ache that started last week, low and dull, only at night, and the hope that maybe today, with enough chewing, it will fade. Tooth care in the 1200s wasn't about smiles or whiteness. It was about avoiding agony. Dental pain could mean sleepless nights, infection, fever, or worse. The tools were rudimentary, but the knowledge was not entirely absent. Medieval peasants observed their own bodies closely. They noticed which foods made a tooth throb, which drinks soothed swollen gums, and which days the pain sharpened. They adapted with what they had. The idea of daily cleaning wasn't widespread, but many peasants maintained oral rituals around specific events, before feast days, after illness, at the turn of a season, after hard bread or tough meat. They used toothpicks, often made from fish bones or carved splinters. Children were taught to chew fennel or anise seeds to freshen their breath and help with digestion. For adults, it was habit, a way to take back some control in a body ruled by labor and chance. When pain came, though, the tone changed. Gums that swelled, bled, or pulled back were seen as signs of deeper trouble. Poultices were the first line of defense. A mash of boiled sage and honey might be packed against the cheek. Some used vinegar steeped with cloves or myrrh, pressing soaked rags to the gums. The heat of a fire-heated pebble held near the jaw was thought to draw out bad humors. Salt water was common too, burning, cleansing, leaving the mouth raw but somehow lighter. And yet, when all remedies failed, there was the pulling. Teeth weren't taken out with precision. They were gripped and yanked, twisted until the root snapped or tore. In larger villages, a blacksmith or travelling tooth drawer might offer their services. They carried iron tongs, soaked in wine or vinegar between uses, and worked quickly. The cost was small, often a loaf of bread or a wedge of cheese, but the pain was great. Still, people paid. Others did it themselves. A string, a door, a sudden yank, a strong friend, and a silent room. Some left the bad teeth alone and simply adapted. They chewed with the other side. They drank warm broth and mashed roots. They ignored the bleeding. They waited for the tooth to fall out. Peasants feared the rot. They called it toothworm sometimes, believing a creature inside was burrowing deeper. And though they had no microscopes, they weren't entirely wrong. Bacteria did the work of decay in silence. It ate away not just at the tooth, but at the ability to eat, sleep, and speak. People grew quiet with pain. They turned inward. A sore tooth changed a person's rhythm. And so, simple acts, wiping teeth, chewing herbs, rinsing with water, became lines of defense. Status played a role too. A man missing too many teeth might be passed over for work requiring clear speech. A woman with swollen cheeks might be whispered about. A child with rotting teeth might be seen as neglected. Clean teeth weren't expected, but pain-free mouths were noticed. There was pride in being able to chew bread without wincing, or to speak without flinching. There were also moments of care between people. A wife preparing a cloth soaked in sage and oil for her husband. A grandmother giving her chewing stick to a child, instructing him on where to bite. These small exchanges were not just hygiene, they were affection, quiet, practical, and necessary. And so the routines continued. A tooth wipe in the morning, a twig before bed, a rinse with warm water after stew. These habits didn't guarantee a pain-free mouth, but they helped. They delayed the worst. They gave people the sense that even in a world of mud, fire, and stone, they could still tend to the part of themselves that bore every word, every meal, every breath. Still, after another quiet rub with your cloth and a swish of bitter herb, water, the thought lingers. If you know the pain will return one day, why do you keep fighting it off so carefully? Every morning, the tooth finally loosens. Not all at once. It begins with a strange ache in the gum, then a shifting, then a sharp edge when you bite. You press your tongue to it often now. It wobbles with each movement. A little more today than yesterday. You know what is coming. You've known for weeks. There's no ceremony for this, no farewell, no priest to mark the moment when a tooth that has served you through years of bread and broth and harsh seasons is finally leaving. Losing a tooth in the medieval world wasn't rare, but it was still personal. It marked a shift in ability. You chewed differently. You spoke differently. Sometimes you even smiled differently. In the poorest corners of the village, few noticed. Everyone had their missing molars and soft spots. But in yourself, you felt it. A little less whole, a little more cautious. You sit by the hearth and take out your stick. The birch end is frayed, the fibers brown and stiff now. You consider trimming it with your knife, starting fresh. But then you realize this will be the last time you use it on that tooth. You chew slowly, then shift to cloth. The linen wrap is thin from use. You dip it in a mixture of water and vinegar with a trace of mint, then press it carefully against your gums. It is not that peasants expected to keep their teeth for life. It's that they valued every year a tooth stayed. A full mouth meant easier eating, clearer speech, less pain. It meant strength. So when one left, it was more than a nuisance. It was a small loss of independence. Some families kept the lost teeth, hiding them in bundles of cloth, or dropping them into the fire as a ward against further illness. Others buried them near doorposts, whispered over them, or tossed them into the woods. Tooth lore lingered at the edges of belief. There were tales of witches using teeth to cast spells, of dogs unearthing old teeth and carrying curses back into homes, of saints who preserved their holy molars in reliquaries. But most villagers simply spat the tooth into the ashes and carried on. Children losing teeth was different. It was marked, sometimes even joked about. A child with a gap-toothed smile might be given a bit of honey or bread to soften the moment. Mothers would press fingers to the child's gum and murmur blessings. It was a sign of growth, not loss. But for adults, losing a tooth was quieter, sadder. It meant wear, time, decline. You remember the first time you saw your father grimace mid-bite. You didn't speak of it, but later that evening, you found his old tooth on the windowsill, already drying. He said nothing. He didn't need to. You set down your cloth and reached for your small bowl of herbal rinse. The scent of sage rises, comforting. You swish it slowly, eyes half closed, letting the bitterness sting and soothe. The tooth will come, out in a day or two. When it does, you'll pack the socket with cloth, maybe soaked in garlic oil, maybe with a pinch of salt. You'll eat soft foods. You'll say nothing. Later, someone may notice your changed smile, or they won't, but you'll know. And you'll chew more slowly on that side. You'll keep the cloth cleaner. You'll chew longer on mint stalks. Because one fewer tooth doesn't mean less care. It means more. And in this world, where the body is your only constant, where pain can arrive quietly and leave you altered, even the small routines, the cloth, the stick, the rinse, are anchors. You fold your linen neatly, as always, and place it near the fire to dry. The warmth will help. The vinegar will keep it sharp. And in the dark, as you drift to sleep, you run your tongue over the loose tooth one last time, as if to remember it before it's gone. And perhaps, in that quiet moment, you wonder, how many things do we lose slowly, day by day, without ever realizing their worth until they're gone? You sit near the hearth, a wooden bowl of water at your feet. The fire is low, barely glowing, and the cold of early dawn clings to the stone floor. You dip your hands into the bowl, then lift your fingers to your scalp, rubbing at your roots with stiff, deliberate motions. The water is not warm, the oil in your hair is not recent, and the comb you'll reach for next has teeth made from horn and splinters. This is how you tend to your head, not with lather, not with bubbles, not with bottles lined in a row, but with time, habit, and a strange kind of patience. In the 1200s, the medieval peasant had no shampoo, no conditioners, no fragrant soap, bars to tame the mess of living hair. But this didn't mean they let it rot on their heads. Hair was watched closely, both as a sign of health and as a source of social meaning. A man with a neat beard and brushed hair might be seen as more orderly, more trustworthy. A woman with oiled braids tucked cleanly behind her veil might draw less whispering from neighbors. To keep one's hair clean was to hold on to a little dignity, and cleanliness came not through soap, but through ash and water. Lye, made by boiling rainwater through ashes collected from the hearth, was the closest thing to soap many villagers had. It stung the eyes, dried the skin, and was unpredictable in strength. But when mixed properly and used cautiously, it could lift grease from the scalp and soften the itch of sweat. Peasants would heat the mixture gently, test it on their fingers, then pour it slowly over their heads, while kneeling near a drain or in the grass behind their homes. A brisk rubbing followed, and then rinsing with cold water, for those without access to enough ash or water to waste on a rinse. Dry cleaning methods were more common. Combing was essential. A daily combing helped remove lice, dirt, and the small debris of daily labor. Combs were often handmade, some carved from bone, others from horn or wood. The teeth were thick and wide for detangling, or fine and close for lice removal. Women in particular might spend long minutes each morning with the comb, passing it through with care, catching tangles, watching what fell. Oiling was another solution. Animal fats were used in place of conditioner, not to clean, but to manage. Bear fat, goose grease, or even rendered sheep tallow might be rubbed into the ends of dry or fraying hair, especially in the winter. The smell was heavy, but in the cold air, it kept the strands supple and gave the illusion of smoothness. Some mixed the fat with herbs, rosemary for scent, nettle to strengthen, chamomile for softness. These oils were rubbed in with the palms, often in front of the hearth where the warmth made them easier to spread. Hair was rarely cut short unless by necessity, illness, punishment, or religious duty. Most women wore their hair long, often braided or tucked beneath wimples and linen caps. Men might wear theirs to the collar, or shorter if they worked in fields. But shaving was rare, cutting tools were not precise, and a bad haircut could lead to ridicule. Still, a tidy head was admired. On feast days, some peasants combed and oiled their hair before donning clean shifts. Children were often combed with less gentleness, their cries sharp, but quickly silenced by a firm hand and a rinse from the cold bucket. Hair could also be a mark of health. Dullness, thinning, or sores on the scalp were signs of trouble, malnutrition, sickness, or lice. And while lice were common and tolerated to a degree, heavy infestations brought shame. A mother might shave her child's head in secret, burning the clippings and rubbing vinegar into the skin. A man who scratched constantly might sleep alone in the barn. Remedies for lice included garlic, rubbed along the scalp, ashes mixed with oil or vinegar rinses made from fermented apples. And still, beauty played a part. Young women sometimes steeped herbs in water to rinse their hair. Lavender, sage, elderflower. These didn't clean as much as they perfumed. On special days, a few drops of oil might be added to give shine. Men sometimes rubbed their beards with crushed rosemary or scented fat before market. A well-tended head could change how one was seen, even if no one spoke of it directly. All of this was slow, effortful, and imperfect. There were no quick fixes, but for peasants, it was never about perfection. It was about habit, care, and control over the little things. A clean scalp didn't keep the taxes low. Neat hair didn't make the harvest better. But in a world of dirt and labor, it gave you a kind of order, something to tend, something to preserve. And as you set the bowl aside and reach for your horn, comb, teeth worn smooth with years of use, the question stirs beneath the surface. What does it say about a person? How they treat the part of themselves they can never see? Your comb catches near the back of your neck, tugging gently where sweat has dried the strands into small knots. You pause, breathe, and start again, this time pulling more slowly. The hair will part eventually. The knots are from sleep and labor, from straw pillows and afternoon sun. They aren't a fault. They're just part of being here. And with enough time, even the toughest tangle comes free. Hair, for a medieval peasant, was a daily consideration. Not because anyone expected glamour, but because neglect brought problems. Tangled hair caught lice. Uncombed hair matted and smelled. Dirty hair showed laziness or illness. Clean hair, even if not fine or decorated, was noticed. Quietly, respectfully. And managing it wasn't always a private affair. Women especially had patterns. Each morning began with loosening whatever braids or wrappings had kept their hair bound through the night. Then came combing. Slow, methodical, a task often helped along by a sister, daughter, or mother. For those with long hair, braiding was more than style. It was control. A single thick braid kept the strands together under a bonnet or veil. Twin braids pinned around the head showed a bit more effort, perhaps on feast days or market mornings. Loose hair was rare and mostly confined to young girls or to grief. Covering the hair was a social norm, shaped by modesty, practicality, and weather. Women wore linen coifs or woolen hoods in winter. These kept lice out and warmth in. A married woman walking bareheaded might raise eyebrows, while a widow might let her veil hang low and loose, signaling mourning. Hair became a quiet language of life events, braided tightly after childbirth, kept covered in illness, perhaps even shaved when plague passed through, and the lice became too many. Men managed their hair differently. Shorter cuts, trimmed with knives, were the standard for laborers. A peasant working near animals or the forge could not risk long hair catching or burning. A man's beard was sometimes left untrimmed in winter for warmth. But before feast days or public events, a tidy, shave or combed beard was preferred. Animal fat could tame unruly beards, especially when mixed with a sprig of rosemary or elder leaf. For some, this was pride. For others, it was just part of dressing. Then there were remedies, plants and routines that blurred the line between hygiene and health. Nettle rinse was used to strengthen the root, according to old women who swore by it. Horsetail was steeped and poured through the scalp to prevent baldness. Vinegar rinses were common after lye washing. Their sharpness, believed to restore balance and shine. Boiled chamomile lightened fair hair slightly, especially after long sun exposure. Ash mixes, if made too strong, could dry the scalp and cause flakes, something peasants learned to avoid by careful dilution and testing. Children were taught to care for their hair early. A girl of 6 might already know how to twist a simple, braid or comb her younger siblings. A boy might be tasked with trimming a brother's hair or holding a mirror shard while his father scraped away the beard. These were not grand lessons. They were part of learning how to live in a body, how to appear ready, how not to be the one others stared at for the wrong reasons. Hair was also tied to belief. Some thought hair held heat, and to lose too much was to fall sick. Others believed the hair closest to the neck should not be cut, as it guarded one's strength. In rare cases, locks of hair were used in charms, tied into cloth and buried at thresholds to protect children or crops. And when death came, hair could be combed as a final act of care, braided gently or covered neatly before the body was prepared. Even in poverty, these gestures remained. A poor woman might not own fine oil, but she could heat her comb before using it. A man might not trim his beard daily, but he could clean it before Sunday. These were acts of quiet discipline, made in places where everything else, weather, crops, taxes, was beyond control. And so you continue combing. The knots are gone now, and your fingers glide more easily. You reach for the linen cap that keeps your hair from tangling through the day. It's thin from washing, but still soft. You tuck the last lock behind your ear, fold it into the cap, and pull it snug. And you wonder, is hair really just hair? Or is it the one thing we shape every day to remind ourselves we still belong to the world? Your hair smells faintly of ash and rosemary. The scent is not strong, but it stays close, a whisper on your clothes when the wind shifts. You've cleaned it the best you could. The lye was thin this time, not strong enough to sting, but enough to lift the worst of the winter oil. Your comb glides a little easier through the ends now, though it still catches near the crown. You'll leave it braided today, better to keep it from tangling in the wind. In a world without mirrors, you rarely see yourself, but you feel your hair always, against your neck in the summer heat, damp beneath your linen in winter, falling forward when you bow your head for prayer, or brushing your cheek when you rise from the field. It is constant, and for medieval peasants, it was more than a nuisance. It was one of the few personal things a person could fully control. Over time, a person's hair told a quiet story. If you saw a woman with her hair braided high, neatly pinned under a clean veil, you knew she had time that morning. If a man's beard was combed, perhaps he'd been to market or hoped to go soon. Children with clean, oiled hair likely had a careful mother. Old men with wisps of dry white hair still tucked them under caps out of habit. Widows might let their hair down only in private, washing it with tears and rainwater. Even within households, hair became part of routines that signaled closeness. A mother combing her child's scalp for lice was performing both hygiene and comfort. A wife braiding her husband's hair before a holy day was both preparing him and claiming a place in his image. Among friends, washing each other's hair on rare summer bath days was a gesture of trust. Few things were more vulnerable than being bareheaded and wet in front of another. Hair, too, was bound to survival. Lice were not a shame. Everyone had them. But unchecked infestations could lead to sickness or sores. Regular combing, vinegar rinses, and herbal rubs were the best defenses. Ashes mixed with fat formed a kind of salve, harsh but cleansing. Sulfur, though rare, could be steeped into ointments. Some villagers even believed certain curses lodged themselves in tangled hair, and untangling them could free the spirit. Despite the grime of everyday life, vanity still existed. It wasn't spoken of as vanity, but it was there, in the girl, who steeped her braid in elderflower before meeting her betrothed, or the boy who trimmed his fringe carefully before feast day. It existed in the way women wove coloured threads through their braids, or how men shaped their beards with thumb and blade. Hair was a tool of presentation, simple, honest, and occasionally aspirational. There were consequences for neglect. A person who never combed might be labelled mad, sick, or cursed. Hair that matted into ropes was sometimes seen as punishment from God or sign of demonic possession. Even priests preached about the order of the body, reminding congregants to keep themselves clean as a form of devotion, not for beauty, but for discipline, for reverence. As time went on, and as years passed over the heads of those who had little else, hair became a record. Children remembered the smell of their mother's hair as she bent to kiss them. Men remembered combing the last of their wife's braids when her hands grew too weak. Old women sometimes kept the combs of daughters long married, tucked into chests with bits of twine and faded ribbon. And when death came, there was the final combing. Always. The body, cleaned with water and ash. The hair gently brushed, oiled if possible, tucked behind ears or braided and pinned. Even for those who died alone, someone eventually prepared them. No peasant was buried tangled if someone loved them. You stand now, pulling your shawl over your shoulders, your cap snug against your head. Your braid is clean. Not perfect, but yours. The air is cool, and the wind picks up as you step outside. You feel your hair shift beneath the linen, but it doesn't pull. It moves like a thread sewn into the day's beginning. And as you walk toward the fields, you think, if the world forgets your name, will it still remember the hands that combed your hair each morning? You wake to the weight of it. The tunic, thick with last week's labour, folded near the hearth where it dried stiff overnight. It smells of sweat, smoke, damp wool, and something older, something like the memory of work. You lift it to your nose, not to test its cleanliness. That isn't the question. The only question is whether it's dry. And and it is. So you pull it over your head and begin your day. In the 1200s, peasants wore the same clothes day after day, sometimes for weeks, sometimes until the season turned. Washing was not frequent. Water was not plentiful. Soap, if it existed at all in your village, was either harsh lie or something you bartered for once a year. So clothes weren't cleaned in the way you might expect. They were managed, rotated, hung to air, and when that wasn't enough, they were scrubbed with ashes or soaked in stale urine. Yes, urine. It was not a secret, nor a last resort. It was a cleaning agent, a necessary one. Human waste, when left to ferment, became ammonia-rich. This helped break down grease, loosen dirt, and kill lice. Urine was collected in pots outside the home or kept in jars tucked near the barn. A full chamber pot, set in the sun for days, became a valuable tool, especially for cleaning wool. Wool was the most common fabric for peasants. It was scratchy, durable, water-resistant, and locally sourced. Sheared from village sheep, spun by hand or spindle wheel and woven at home, it became cloaks, tunics, hose, and caps. And while warm and protective, wool was also prone to holding odors. It absorbed sweat and smoke and never quite let go. Washing it too often or too roughly ruined the fibers. So most peasants brushed dirt off their garments when dry, aired them on branches, or shook them clean near streams. But occasionally, before holy days, at harvest time, or when an infestation struck, real washing was done. Clothes were laid in wooden troughs, soaked in stale urine, and left to steep. After several hours, they were beaten with paddles or trampled underfoot. This agitation loosened grime and helped the urine reach deeper fibers. Afterward, the garments were rinsed in stream water, then wrung out and hung in sunlight to dry. No perfumes were used, no softeners, just wind, water, and time. Undergarments, if owned at all, were linen. These were rarer and more precious, often made from homespun flax. Because linen could be washed more easily and didn't felt like wool, it saw water more often. A peasant lucky enough to own 2 shirts might rotate them, soaking one while wearing the other. Soapwort, a naturally foaming herb, was sometimes added to rinse water. In wealthier villages, crushed roots or ashes provided lather, but most cleansers were rough. Laundry was not gentle. It was survival. Children's clothes followed. The same rhythms. They wore miniature versions of adult tunics, patched and handed down between siblings. When soiled with mud, waste, or food, these garments were brushed off and shaken. Soaking was rare. Parents prioritized warmth over cleanliness. A hole was a bigger concern than a stain. Lice were ever present. Wool, especially unlined wool, made a perfect home for the tiny creatures. Cloaks and caps, once infested, required attention. They were sometimes buried in snow in winter, frozen to kill eggs. In summer, they were left hanging in trees or over smoky fires. Some peasants rubbed their seams with garlic or crushed herbs as a deterrent, but nothing lasted. Lice always returned, and yet, shame was not always attached to dirty clothes. Everyone lived in dirt. Everyone sweated, worked, and wore the same cloak for weeks. What mattered was care, patching holes, mending tears, adjusting worn hems. A tunic with signs of repair showed attention. A clean-smelling cloak on feast day showed effort. Even if your clothes were coarse, even if they never touched scented soap, how you kept them said something about you. On rare occasions, like weddings or pilgrimages, peasants borrowed better garments from neighbors or kin. These shared clothes were aired between uses, brushed clean, and handed back with thanks. A shirt with lace trim or a hood lined with softer wool was not owned. It was remembered. And in some villages, the community kept a shared bundle of good clothes, stored in the chapel or manor outbuilding, available for solemn rites and holy days. Still, your everyday tunic remains the one constant. You know its weight. You know the feel of its seams against your skin. You know where the shoulder was stitched by your aunt, and how the cuff frays, no matter how many times you patch it. You don't wash it often, but when you do it with the same care your grandmother did. Slow, foul-smelling, methodical. And when it dries in the sun, stiff and clean in its own strange way, you feel something close to pride. You pull on your cloak now, the one with the stain that never left. It smells of the barn, the fire, and you. And as you step out into the wind, you wonder, if your clothes carry your life in every fiber, do they tell the story better than you ever could? You tug at the sleeve where the seam is loosening again. It caught on a thorn last week, and now it frays more with each day. You will sew it tonight, or ask someone with steadier fingers to do it for you. For now, it hangs loose. It is one of dozens of small repairs made over time, some crude, others careful. You know them all. You feel them like landmarks when you dress in the half-light. Each patch, each tightening of thread, a record of days survived. In the medieval village, a peasant's garments were few, but they were personal. A man might own 2 tunics, one for work and one for holy days. A woman might have one good shift, worn for festivals and births. Children often wore the clothes of their older siblings, cut down or tied up, leaving visible traces of the body that wore them before. New clothes were rare, cloth was dear, time was scarce. So mending became a quiet, steady skill passed through generations. The tools were simple: bone needles, homespun thread, and fingers practiced in patience. Cloth was often reused from old garments, cut into strips, stitched over holes, reinforced where wear was worst: elbows, knees, hems. A patched cloak said more about your life than a new one ever could. It showed labor, it showed endurance, it showed that the garment and the person had lasted. Odor too was familiar. A tunic did not smell of rosewater or lavender. It smelled of lard and smoke, sheep oil, and the damp earth of early spring. Wool, once soaked in piss and beaten clean, carried a faint sharpness even after rinsing, but it was not unpleasant to those who lived in it. In fact, each person's clothes had their own scent, a blend of field, hearth, and skin. The odor was not masked. It was known, recognizable, intimate. Still, there were efforts to improve it. Herbs played a small role. On washing days, dried. Leaves of mint or sage might be tossed into the rinse water, not to cleanse, but to add a passing freshness. Juniper branches laid in storage chests helped ward off moths and left a crisp scent on woolen cloaks. Women sometimes tucked herb bundles into their bodices or wore garlands that perfumed the neck and collar. But the smells of the body always returned. Peasants understood the rhythms of cloth. They knew which fabrics itched worse in summer, which seams chafed under heavy loads. They lined cloaks with moss or grass in winter. They greased boots with fat to keep them soft. They watched the skies for sun when clothes were laid out to dry. They turned them over with sticks, not hands. They understood that a day too damp could undo a week's work. Laundry, when done communally, became a time of gathering. Women met near rivers or at large wooden tubs. They brought their urine pots, their paddles, their bundles of cloth. Children played nearby, and older girls learned to scrub hems against stone. They compared patches, admired well-mended sleeves, shared lye mixtures or tricks for stubborn stains. It was work, but it was not lonely, and in a world where labor often kept people apart, laundry brought them together. Clothing also spoke of status in subtle ways. The poor wore coarse wool. The slightly better off had finer weaves, dyed with browns, reds, or soft blues. A bit of embroidery, even poorly done, marked extra care. A belt with a small metal clasp was a luxury. Shoes with leather soles instead of wooden ones drew notice. But these differences, while visible, did not define worth as sharply as they might now. What mattered most was readiness, being clothed, being presentable, being patched. As the years wore on, garments changed hands. A father's cloak might become his daughter's blanket. A mother's apron might be turned into a child's hood. Cloth was too precious to waste. Even worn-out rags were saved, used to strain milk, polish, tools, or bind wounds. When nothing remained but threads, those too might be burned for warmth or scattered in the garden as mulch. And through it all, the clothes kept their stories. You remember the time your sleeve tore in a storm and your sister sewed it with nettle, thread while laughing. You remember the cloak your mother gave you when you came of age, already mended, already yours. You remember watching your grandfather fold his tunic with care, even in his last days. as if it still mattered how it lay. You run your fingers now along the hem of your own tunic. The stitching is uneven, but it holds. It has held through cold and heat, through labor and grief. It is not clean by modern measure, but it is kept, and in the keeping, it becomes more than cloth. And you wonder, when a garment outlives the one who wore it, does it still carry the shape of their days? The afternoon sun warms the shoulder of your tunic as you walk home from the fields. A thread from the neckline has come loose again, curling like a question mark against your chest. You'll fix it later, with a piece of old thread and a needle, dulled from years of use. Not because anyone will see it, but because you'll feel it, and because your hands still remember how to mend what might otherwise fall apart. Peasant life was not a parade of new things. Clothes especially were rare, gifts, hard-earned, hard-kept, and hard-used. In this scarcity, clothing became one of the most personal artifacts a medieval villager possessed. It bore the shape of their body. It learned the curve of their spine, the slope of their shoulders, the way they moved when tired. A tunic that, fit poorly, at first slowly molded itself to the wearer, like a second skin not by design, but by daily friction and shared time. For some, a single tunic might last a decade. The fabric would thin, the color would fade from sun and smoke, the edges would fray. But these were not flaws. They were signs of use. Holes were patched, not hidden. A good patch, one that held tight and didn't chafe, was a mark of care, not failure. And when garments grew too threadbare to be worn in public, they became sleep clothes, or were repurposed into smaller garments for children. It was common for clothes to pass between generations. A father might gift his wedding tunic to a son coming of age. A mother might pass on her best woolen shift, carefully stored in a linen sack for years. These heirlooms were not ornate. They were not embroidered or laced with silk, but they were full of history. A worn knee might remind a child of their parents' labor. A stain from a festival wine might recall a rare moment of joy. Even within marriages, garments held meaning. A newly married woman might receive a cap or apron as part of her dowry. A man might stitch his initials onto the inside of his wife's cloak, not for show, but so it wouldn't be lost at the communal bath or the church vestibule. These little gestures, sewn in private and rarely seen, were acts of quiet love. They required no audience. The poor had few illusions. No one expected to look fine. But on feast days, a clean cloak and mended tunic could make someone feel presentable in church. During festivals, colored ribbons tied to a belt or a fresh sprig of greenery tucked behind the ear gave a festive air. Some villagers dyed the ends of old garments with whatever they had. Onion skins for yellow, beetroot for red, woad for blue. Even if the color faded in days, it was enough. There was also pride in presentation, not vanity, but order. A boy who arrived at church with a clean shirt and combed hair was seen as well raised. A woman with carefully pinned sleeves, even if her dress was patched, was respected. In grief, people dressed in dark or simple clothing. In celebration, they wore the best of what they had, even if it was stiff with age or threadbare at the elbows. Clothes became part of the unspoken language of village life, and when clothes reached their final state, unwearable, unrecoverable, they were not simply discarded. They were used until their last thread could be of service. Rags were soaked in vinegar and pressed to fevers. Strips were tied around splints or used to bind herbs for storage. Some were stuffed into cracks in walls for insulation, or braided into ropes for household tasks. Even in death, clothes lingered. A burial shroud might be an old shift, washed one last time in river water, wrapped with care and reverence. You reach your cottage now, the smell of smoke drifting from the chimney. You untie your cloak and hang it by the door. It still smells of field and sun. You see the patch you added last month, crooked but solid. Your hands know every stitch. Every repair tells a story, and none of them are forgotten. You fold the tunic slowly, smoothing the wrinkles with your palm. It is not clean by modern sense, but it is yours. It is kept. It is remembered. And you ask yourself, when the world writes its histories in stone and ink, will it ever remember the quiet language of thread, of cloth, of care? The air is still, cool and faintly sweet with the scent of damp earth. You step carefully, barefoot on the grass, carrying the old wooden bucket in one hand and your shift tucked under the other. The moon is high, casting a pale silver across. The field and the village is quiet behind you. Only the sounds of insects and the distant rush of stream water break the silence. You've chosen this hour because no one will be watching. Not your neighbors, not your mother, not even your own children, asleep on the straw pallet at home. Bathing is personal. Bathing is rare. Bathing is uncertain. In the 1200s, bathing was not what it would later become. It was not daily, not ritualized in the religious sense, not necessarily about health in the modern meaning of the word. It was a mixture of utility and caution, shaped by superstition, resource scarcity, and the harsh realities of the medieval environment. People did bathe, but not in the way one might expect, and almost never without thought or consequence. Peasants rarely had access to private bathing spaces. Most homes were single-roomed, without fireplaces, without drainage, and without any real concept of plumbing. The act of bathing involved heating water, hauling it from streams or wells, and pouring it into basins, buckets, or wooden tubs if one was lucky enough to own one. Fuel for fire was precious, and so water was warmed sparingly. Sometimes a cloth was used instead, a rough, soaked linen rubbed over arms and legs while standing by the fire. Not quite a bath, but close enough to feel cleaner than before. And yet, despite the hardship, there were moments when peasants chose to fully wash themselves. Often, this happened in warmer months. Outdoors, under the cover of twilight or very early morning, there was no notion of stripping naked in the sunlight or washing in front of others. Modesty was deep-rooted, not from prudery, but from necessity. To be seen without clothes was to be exposed, not just physically, but socially. It hinted at madness, punishment, or desperation. Bathing also carried a shadow of danger. Medieval people believed that washing opened the pores, and through open pores, sickness might enter. The idea of vulnerability lingered, especially during colder months. To bathe was to invite chill. To invite chill was to tempt fever. Even physicians of the time recommended against excessive washing, especially with warm water, which was believed to weaken the body's natural defenses. Public bathhouses did exist in cities and some towns, but for rural villagers and peasants, these were unknown or unreachable luxuries. And even in cities, bathhouses began to fall out of favor due to associations with disease and immorality. For a peasant woman, the act of bathing became a quiet rebellion against the grime of daily life. It wasn't indulgence, it was survival, but it had to be done discreetly, which is why you are here, stepping quietly toward the small spring at the edge of the wood. The water is cold, clear, fed by an underground trickle that's been running as long as you can remember. You place your bucket beside it, dip your hands in, and hiss softly at the temperature. There is no soap, only a linen cloth, a bit of sand, and crushed mint leaves, saved from the herb garden. You begin with your feet, then your hands, then your arms. You rinse your face last, the cold water drawing a gasp from your lungs. You don't linger. The cold seeps quickly into your bones, and your ears are always listening for footsteps, for voices, for anything out of place. You wash only what is necessary. You do not scrub. You do not soak. You clean. Back in the village, there are whispers of people who bathe too often, girls said to be vain, or boys called lazy for spending time at the river when they could be mending fences. Cleanliness was not always admired. In fact, it was sometimes met with suspicion. If you looked too clean, too polished, you were assumed to be shirking work or imitating the nobility, or worse, hiding something. It was better to look worn, but kept, dusty, but respectable. Children were washed less frequently than adults, unless there was a risk of illness. Newborns were wiped clean with warm cloths and wrapped quickly, often not bathed again for weeks. Toddlers ran barefoot and bare-legged in all seasons, their dirt considered normal, even healthy. Only when fevers came or rashes spread did mothers turn to washing. Despite all of this, there was also a kind of joy in water. Peasants knew its worth. A river was not only for drinking or farming, it was where lovers whispered in the dark, where children splashed on summer days, where solitude could be found in a noisy world. But these moments were fleeting, earned after long days, and often weighed down by caution. You finish rinsing and dress quickly, the damp shift clinging to your skin as you tie the sash at your waist. Your arms are still wet. You let the wind dry them. The moon hangs lower now. The village begins to stir. Chickens rustle in their roosts. You walk back slowly, tunic over your arm, hair damp, skin tingling, and as the path crunches softly beneath your feet, you wonder if the simplest act of washing feels like freedom. Why does it carry so much fear? You stir the fire with the end of a stick, your fingers still stiff from the night's cold water. Steam rises faintly from your drying tunic draped over the chair. It smells better now, not fresh in any grand way, but cleaner, as if the dust and sweat of the last week have been softened into something you can carry a little more comfortably. The cloth is wrinkled but pliant again, no longer stiff with old effort. It will dry by mid-morning. No one will ask where you were. In villages of the 1200s, secrecy around bathing was less about shame and more about survival. Everything that exposed the body also exposed the soul, or so people believed. In religious doctrine and popular folklore, alike water was never just water. It was the element of change, of transformation, of spiritual peril. Priests warned that cleanliness might lead to vanity, that opening oneself to water invited a flood of temptation, and so peasants, who understood the weight of every superstition, approached cleanliness with caution. Quiet, private, never casual. There were tales told of those who washed at the wrong hour and fell sick. A woman who bathed in a stream under a full moon lost her sight, villagers said. A boy who swam in early spring carried chills into summer. These stories were not confirmed, but they were believed. Water was useful, water was beautiful, but it was not always safe, and it was never entirely yours. This made communal washing both a necessity and a tension. On market days or feast eve mornings, women might gather near the edges of streams with buckets, linen cloths, and bundles of undergarments. Washing clothing was not the same as bathing, of course, but as skirts were hitched and sleeves rolled, it came close. Eyes watched. Conversations grew hushed. The older women were more confident, having seen it all. Younger girls lingered back, hoping to avoid scrutiny. If someone arrived too clean too often, whispers would begin. Maybe she spent too much time thinking of her reflection. Maybe she wandered too freely near the woods. Maybe she had secrets. And so, most people stayed in the middle ground, clean enough to be decent, not so clean as to be noticed. Men approached bathing differently. They washed hands and faces more routinely, sometimes with ashes or vinegar when water was scarce. They might strip to the waist and rinse in the river after a long day of threshing or haymaking, but never fully disrobe. It wasn't modesty alone. It was fear of what the river might take. Strong currents, sudden illness, unseen creatures, all were part of the world beneath the water's skin. And yet, even with all this caution, there were rhythms to cleanliness. Women washed after childbirth when strength returned. Men cleansed before weddings or feast days. Children were scrubbed down each spring. Feet and faces raw from the rough cloth and cold water. Everyone eventually reached a point when the grime became too heavy to carry. Then, and only then, did they make their way to water. Some villages had washing stones, flat slabs beside slow-moving parts of a stream, where people gathered for laundering. These were safer places, both physically and socially, than isolated forest springs. Here, under the light of day, with others present, bathing rituals could be folded into the mundane. A quick rinse of the neck, a soak of sore feet. No shame, no superstition, just chores. There were even customs around which herbs should be burned nearby. Sweet fennel for protection, lavender for calm, mugwort to keep away bad spirits. Some people crossed themselves before entering water. Others whispered old sayings, not prayers exactly, but not far off, just in case. At home, heated water was rare. If a family had fuel to spare, a pot might be placed over the hearth to warm enough water for sponge bathing. One cloth per person, often shared, dipped and wrung again and again. The order mattered. Face, then arms, then feet. The body's middle stayed largely untouched unless there was sickness, blood, or special need. Children fidgeted, adults worked quickly, no one lingered. On feast days, things changed. Clean clothes were expected. Hair was combed. Nails were scrubbed. A basin of fresh water was set out and used carefully. This was the only time villagers might comment openly on someone's cleanliness, praising a polished shoe, a smoothed tunic, a pleasantly scented scarf. Pride was quiet but present. The transformation from dusty to decent was brief, but it was real. Still, even on holy days, full-body bathing was rare. It took effort, it required risk, and it brought too much attention. Most chose a simple rinse, a borrowed fragrance from crushed leaves or wildflowers, and the hope that the illusion of cleanliness would be enough to satisfy both neighbor and priest. You pour what remains in your bucket over a patch of thirsty herbs by the door, watching the steam rise as it hits the soil. The day is beginning. Your children stretch and stir. You'll cook soon, and work, and carry the weight of living again. But for now, you feel lighter, just a little. And you think, if water can strip away the world's weight for only an hour, is that enough to make the risk worth it? Later in the evening, as the sun lowers and the smoke from hearths rises in thin grey plumes above the thatched roofs, you sit by the door in your shift, brushing the tangles from your damp hair with a comb made of horn. It catches on knots and pulls at your scalp, but you welcome the sting. It means your hair is not too matted. It means your body is still yours, clean, or as close to it as you can manage. You can still feel the echo of the morning's rinse along your arms and neck. The warmth of the fire dries your sleeves slowly. The smell of mint lingers faintly beneath the more familiar scents of wool, wood smoke, and work. You will not bathe again for weeks, maybe longer, but for this moment, you carry a feeling that is rare in your life: relief. Throughout the medieval countryside, bathing was a luxury not of wealth but of timing. Time to gather water, time to heat it, time to do it quietly and without being seen, time to rest afterward so the cold would not turn into fever. Even with all the effort, it was never guaranteed to go well. A sudden breeze might chill your bones. A neighbor might ask too many questions. A child might wake and cry. And still, people did it. Even the poorest peasants tried to hold on to moments of dignity. A bowl of water before bed, a change of shift on a Sunday, a strip of linen, wiped along the nape of the neck and under the arms before a holy day. None of it was elaborate, but it was consistent. Across the villages of medieval Europe, people did not live in filth because they enjoyed it. They lived in it because they had to. But when they could, they made room for a bit of washing, a small ritual, a stolen hour, a relief from the weight of the body's constant labor. Herbs played their part, not just for scent, but for health. In some homes, bundles of thyme and rue were tied above the door or hung over the hearth. When water was available, these herbs were steeped and added to washing basins. It was believed they helped protect against illness. In fact, this belief was not entirely wrong. Some of the herbs did have mild antiseptic properties, but mostly they added comfort. They turned necessity into something gentler. Some folk healers taught that washing with certain herbs during certain moon phases could keep away skin ailments or bad dreams. Others warned against bathing during menstruation or on saints' days, believing it weakened the body's defenses or disrespected the holy order of time. These were not universal beliefs. They varied by village, by family, by season, but always, water was seen as powerful, sometimes helpful, sometimes dangerous. There were seasons for bathing too. Spring brought melted snow and the chance to finally scrub away winter's soot. Summer allowed river swims, especially for children, though always under supervision and rarely without nervous glances upstream. Autumn brought cooler air and more hesitation. Winter, unless absolutely necessary, was a time to stay dry and bundled. A cold wash in December might mean sickness in January, and in the absence of medicine, illness was no small thing. Clothes helped carry the illusion of cleanliness. A cloak brushed free of straw, a shift aired out overnight, a combed beard, a braided braid. Villagers took pride where they could, in presentation and in effort. They knew the difference between unwashed and uncared for. The former was expected, the latter judged. Sometimes an entire household might share a wash day, a rare warm evening, a bit of leftover fuel, a mood that allowed it. Buckets filled, cloths soaked, bodies cleaned as best they could manage. The children first, the elders with help, parents last. No one bathed luxuriously, but everyone emerged a little lighter. As you sit now, The fire lowering to embers, your hair fully dry and your tunic newly donned, you feel that small lightness in your chest. You will not speak of it. You will not brag. You will not confess to neighbors that you snuck off in the dark to bathe under the moon. But you will sleep more easily tonight. You will feel the smoothness of your skin against the rough linen. And tomorrow, when your hands are again covered in soil and your tunic stiff with sweat, you will remember this feeling, not as indulgence, but as an act of care. And you wonder if the world could pause for just 1 hour each week, for nothing more than water and quiet, how many burdens might be washed away before they could even take root. You wake with an itch at the nape of your neck, not sharp, not urgent, just familiar. You reach up to scratch it under the edge of your coif, the linen head covering that keeps your hair tucked away and your scalp hidden from dust and wind. The cloth is warm and slightly stiff with age. You untie it slowly, not wanting to wake the others. Morning light filters through the thatch. The hearth is still cold. You sit up and begin the small daily war, combing your hair before the lice settle in too deep. In the world of medieval peasant life, lice were never entirely gone. They lived among people as surely as smoke lived in the rafters, and mice lived in the corners of the cottage. They were not feared like wolves or fevers, but they were managed, controlled, tolerated only to a point. The tools were simple: a coarse-toothed comb carved from horn or wood, a bit of lard or oil, and the will to scratch and scrape and search. You begin with the comb, teeth close together, but not so close they snap. You drag it through strands thickened with sleep and soot. It snags. You pull. A small white flake falls onto your shift. You flick it away. Some people boil their combs in vinegar. Some smear their scalps with crushed nettle or steeped rosemary to repel the bugs. You once heard of someone who rubbed their head with the ashes of burnt fern. You've never tried it. Hair was rarely cut. Women especially wore their hair long and hidden. To cut it short was either a mark of shame or the sign of a vow. Only nuns or punished women cropped their hair close. Most braided it or coiled it beneath cloth, bound with strips of wool or linen, pinned in place with slivers of wood. Men had more freedom, shorter hair, easier to comb, easier to rinse. But lice found everyone. Bathing did not always include the head. Hair took too long to dry. Wet heads invited chills. And so peasants wiped their scalps with cloth, dabbed with herb water, or left it to the sun and wind to cleanse what they could. In colder months, nothing could be done but cover it and wait for better weather. The lice multiplied then. Everyone knew it. Everyone bore it. Spring brought relief, and scratching brought the only daily resistance. Mothers combed their daughters' hair while sitting by the fire. Fathers checked their sons when the itching became too much. A single louse could become an infestation in a household of 10, so vigilance mattered, and shame was quiet. No one mocked you for having lice, but they might question why you had so many. There were folk beliefs too. Some said that rubbing wild garlic behind the ears would keep the bugs away. Others swore by mint steeped in oil and spread across the scalp with a bit of cloth. One old man claimed to have avoided lice for a year by tying a frog skin to his belt. No one believed him, but no one disproved it either. Hats helped, and hoods. They kept dirt off and hid the worst tangles, but they also trapped heat, sweat, and the insects that liked both. A boy's woolen cap might become a nest if left unwashed too long. So children were sometimes made to sit outside in the sun with their heads uncovered, the light driving out the worst of the bugs. Not a cure, but a reprieve. Hair was not styled. It was kept, managed, bound and braided to stay out of the way, oiled to keep it from breaking. Women sometimes used goose fat mixed with herbs to coat their braids, giving them sheen and strength. It also helped slide lice out during combing. The fat was scraped from cooking pots, warmed by the fire, and stored in small clay cups for just this purpose. Even so, there were times when nothing worked. A child would scratch until blood appeared. A man would shave the back of his neck and hide it under a scarf. A woman would sit by the stream and cry as she picked through her daughter's hair again and again. No one was immune. Not in a one-room house shared with livestock and siblings and smoke. You finish combing and tuck your hair back beneath the coif, tying it snug at the base of your skull. You feel cleaner. Not clean, but better. The lice are not gone, but they are fewer. The scratching will wait. And in the stillness of morning, with the fire just beginning to glow, that is enough. And you wonder, in a world that never stops itching, is the act of combing the closest thing to peace? The fire crackles gently beside you as your youngest leans against your knee, still half asleep, still scratching her scalp. You pick up the horn comb, now warmed by the hearth, and motion for her to sit still. She doesn't protest. She knows the routine. You begin near her temples, careful with the knots, pausing when she winces. The lice are always worse in winter. You whisper to her about spring, about nettle patches and mint baths, knowing it's still weeks away. But it helps. Just the mention of warmth and green. The medieval peasant household combed hair more often than it bathed bodies. Hair was visible, tangled quickly, and gave away a person's condition more than dirty skin ever could. To a stranger passing by, a well-bound braid or smooth coif suggested discipline, care, perhaps even pride. It did not matter that lice still lived beneath the fabric. What mattered was that effort had been made. Mothers taught their daughters how to part and oil hair before braiding. The braids were not decorative, they were defensive. They bound loose strands tightly to keep the hair compact, easier to comb, harder for lice to spread. Some braids were doubled and pinned at the crown. Others were looped behind the ears and tied with scraps of cloth. A few older women added herbs into the braids. Sprigs of lavender or tansy woven near the roots to ward off bugs and soften the smell of sweat. Oiling the hair was common, though oil was never bought. It was made. Rendered goose or pig fat, left over from cooking, was set aside and mixed with mashed herbs or ashes. It was rubbed into the scalp at night, then combed through in the morning. The mixture helped lice slide out with the comb and made hair easier to manage. But it also left stains on shifts and coifs. Some women laid cloths across their pillows to protect the linen. Others simply accepted the marks as part of life. Among peasants, shaving the head was rare and done only in desperation. A lice outbreak, too great to control, or an illness that left the body too weak to resist, might lead to a head being sheared. But this was never done lightly. A bare head invited cold. It marked you apart, and it took months, sometimes years, for hair to return to its former length. Better to comb, better to oil, better to endure. Lice remedies varied by region, but many were passed down orally. A rinse made from walnut leaves, a compress soaked in vinegar, a boiled infusion of rosemary and garlic, poured over the scalp and left to dry. These were not cures, but they helped. Children were often scrubbed with sand by the stream, their hair washed with rainwater collected in cracked pots. If you were lucky, you found what worked for you. If you weren't, you just kept combing. Barber surgeons in towns offered more drastic treatments. Oils that stung the scalp, blades to scrape the skin. But these were expensive and feared. Most villagers never saw a barber in their life. Instead, they relied on each other. Grandmothers examined grandchildren. Sisters checked sisters. A wife might pull lice from her husband's beard and crush them between her nails, saying nothing, just working. In wealthier homes, things were not always better. Nobles wore wigs powdered with crushed herbs or flour, which often worsened infestations. Their servants combed their hair, perfumed their scalps, and sometimes washed it, but lice still crept in. Cleanliness, no matter how well performed, was never complete. Even the queen itched. But for the peasant, scratching had to be hidden. Too much fidgeting in church or at market marked you as careless. Too many visible bugs on a child could bring shame. So parents taught their children to endure, to press their fingers under their coif and scratch quietly, to smile through the discomfort, to plait their hair and walk with pride, even when their heads buzzed like summer grass. Tonight, after supper, you will comb your own hair again. You will do it alone by the hearth, the comb warmed again, the oil thinned by herbs. You will part your hair into two, twist it slowly, wrap it close to your head, and you will tie it with a strip of worn linen, praying it holds until morning. And as you sit in the fire's soft light, your daughter asleep beside you, her own hair smooth for now, you wonder, is it the absence of lice we long for, or just a moment where the itching finally stops? You walk past the chapel as the bell tolls for early mass. Its sound is thin in the morning fog, less like a summons than a reminder. You shift the basket on your hip and pull your cloak closer. Your tunic still smells faintly of smoke and sheep wool. You haven't washed it in 2 weeks, and in this moment you wonder, would a saint have washed it at all? In medieval peasant life, the idea of cleanliness was complicated by holiness. While peasants did what they could to keep clean enough, scrubbing hands, oiling hair, wiping feet, the church sometimes offered a strange and unnerving message that too much washing was suspicious, that the truly holy were marked not by cleanliness, but by their refusal of it, and that some of the most venerated people in the Christian world were, by all accounts, filthy. Stories of saints were told often and with reverence. Children grew up hearing of St. Cuthbert, who slept on the ground and wore the same garments until they decayed. Of St. Francis, who never bathed and considered bodily decay a gift. Of St. Mary of Egypt, who wandered the desert for years, without washing, and was called a vessel of grace for it. These stories were not meant to encourage dirt among the laity, but they left their mark. To suffer in the body was to purify the soul. To reject comfort, warmth, softness, scent, was to draw closer to God. And bathing, with its warmth and pleasure, was seen as indulgent, suspicious, maybe even sinful. So peasants learned a strange line to walk, clean enough for dignity, not so clean as to appear proud, not so fragrant that it seemed like vanity. A whiff of rosemary behind the ears was fine on a feast day, but if someone smelled of roses in winter, questions followed. Priests, sometimes, preached against vanity, not just in dress, but in bodily care. A woman who rinsed her feet too often might be accused of luring attention. A man who combed his beard more than necessary might be called proud. Bathing became a symbol, not just of hygiene, but of where you stood between humility and excess. Yet contradictions remained. In monasteries, monks bathed rarely, perhaps once a month, but they kept their robes orderly, their hair trimmed, their hands rinsed before meals. In noble households, ladies soaked in perfumed baths, their skin rubbed with cloths steeped in spices, even as they fasted and prayed. Cleanliness and sin were judged by context, not clarity. For the poor, this created confusion. You were told that saints embraced their own stench, that Christ himself washed the feet of others, but did not ask to have his own washed. Yet you knew that lice spread sickness, that dirty wounds festered, that foul smells invited exclusion. So you cleaned yourself quietly, without comment, without celebration, just enough. Some believed that saints smelled sweet even in death, that their bodies released no odor of decay, only the scent of lilies or honey or incense. These odors of sanctity were marks of divine favor, and yet, while alive, the same saints often reeked of sweat, fasting, and filth. Their followers didn't mind. They believed the smell was holy. This idea filtered down to the village. You heard tales of an old widow who never washed, but could heal sick lambs with a touch. Of a hermit who bathed only in dew gathered on feast days and was said to see visions in his sleep. These were not always respected, but they were not mocked. Some even lit candles for them, whispered prayers, asked them to intercede. You remember your neighbor's daughter who used to spend hours at the stream with a comb and a mirror shard. One day she stopped, said the priest had warned her of pride, said the saints were dirty and still loved, said she didn't want to tempt fate. Her hair grew tangled, her skin dulled, but her eyes, oddly, seemed brighter, as if she had found purpose in the letting go. Still, most peasants struck a balance. They bathed when they could, scrubbed what was seen, covered what was not. They listened to sermons about modesty, then rinsed their feet at night anyway. They did not want to smell like saints. They wanted to sleep without itching, and as you walk past the chapel, the fog thinning, the bell fading, you touch your wrist and feel the oil you dabbed there earlier. It smells faintly of time. You did it for yourself, not for others. Not to tempt, not to boast, just to feel a little better. And you wonder, if the saints wore their filth like a crown, what might holiness look like for someone who simply wants to feel clean? The priest's voice echoes off the stone walls of the church, slow and deliberate. You sit among your neighbors, the scent of wool and damp earth rising around you. He speaks of St. Simon Stylites, who stood atop a pillar for years without coming down. He never bathed. His body, they said, was covered in sores and insects, yet people came from miles around to hear his words. His stink was a perfume to God, the priest declares. No one laughs. You glance down at your hands, scrubbed clean with vinegar and straw, and you wonder if you have scrubbed too hard. Throughout the 1200s, as church influence deepened, it shaped not only how people prayed, but how they viewed their bodies. Dirt was reinterpreted not just as a condition of poverty, but as a mark of humility. And cleanliness, especially visible, fragrant, pleasurable cleanliness, was something to be wary of. You could wash to remove disease, yes. You could rinse to prepare for communion. But if you seem to enjoy being clean too much, questions might be raised. Monks and nuns, the models of spiritual life, lived by strict codes that often limited bathing. Cistercian monks, for example, might wash only a few times a year, though they were expected to keep their robes and tools in good order. Nuns were sometimes forbidden from looking in mirrors or anointing themselves with oils. Cleanliness was permitted only for health or necessity, not for comfort or beauty. The association between dirt and piety wasn't just symbolic. It was reinforced through literature and legend. Medieval saints' lives, the popular biographies read aloud or retold by firelight, often described holy people as refusing all bodily comfort. They slept on bare floors. They wore iron chains beneath their tunics. They fasted until their teeth fell out. Their rejection of bodily care was proof of their spiritual focus. And yet, villagers couldn't afford extremes. You still had to tend the goats, harvest turnips, mend boots. A fever from filth was still a fever, so the message filtered down differently for common folk. Don't be too clean. Don't look too polished. But don't stink too badly either. Be modest. Be invisible. Smell faintly of herbs, not of flowers. Wash your face, but not too often. Clean your tunic, but don't bleach it bright. Hide the effort. Some took these warnings deeply to heart. There are records of pilgrims refusing to wash during their entire journey, believing that the hardship itself made their prayers stronger. Others covered their heads and faces not to shield from wind or sun, but to avoid tempting pride. They wrapped themselves in layers to avoid attracting the gaze of others. Cleanliness, in some cases, was feared as vanity. Women bore this burden more sharply. A woman who tended too carefully to her hair or skin might be accused of courting lust. There are sermons preserved from the 13th century that describe perfumed women as tools of the devil. Yet women were also expected to appear orderly. Braided hair, neat clothes, a modest smell of basil or sage. The line between humility and impropriety was a thread so thin it often snapped. You remember a neighbor who once dyed her headscarf with elderberry juice and wore it to mass. The color was soft, a gentle plum, but the priest scolded her before the entire congregation. "Why color the cloth that covers the head God gave you?" he asked. After that, no one wore dyed cloth again, even though the cloth had smelled of nothing but earth and boiled leaves. Still, small acts of cleanliness persisted, often hidden. A woman might rinse her feet at the stream just before dark. A man might rub his hands with mint before Sunday. Soapwort was grown in small corners of gardens, not to sell, but to wash infants or the sick. Linen was aired out in wind, even if not fully washed. There was always the silent understanding that being too clean was dangerous, but being too dirty brought shame. And then there were those rare moments when rules bent. On weddings, holy days, feast days, villagers washed more freely. Herbs were burned, scented oils shared. It was as if the body was allowed joy, just for one evening. The next day, of course, you returned to modesty, to the dull browns and greys, to quiet cleanliness. But for one night, you could smell like rosemary and not fear the consequence. You stir from your thoughts as the priest finishes his sermon. Saints do not glitter, he says. They suffer, they fast. They are marked not by silk and spice, but by ash and bone. You look around. No one speaks. The air is thick with silence, and with the smell of old wool, wood smoke, and something else. Perhaps the scent of people trying their best to be holy in the only way they know how. And you wonder, if holiness hides in ash and bone, where does that leave those of us who still long for water and quiet? Later that evening, after the dishes are scraped and the hearth burns low, you sit with your feet tucked beneath you, rubbing your hands with a cloth dampened in thyme water. It's not a full wash, just enough to wipe away the grit from the turnips, the itch from the wood splinters. The scent rises faintly as you press the cloth to your knuckles. You do not pray aloud, but in the quiet of the room, as the children doze and the fire whispers, you feel as though you are part of something older than scripture, something that lives in the space between filth and fragrance. For medieval peasants, the question of how to live rightly with one's body was never simple. Cleanliness could be viewed with suspicion, filth with reverence, suffering sanctified, pleasure threatened the soul, and yet, bodies still needed tending. Hands still cracked, feet still blistered, hair still matted, and skin still stank. And despite all the sermons, all the saint stories, peasants continued to seek some kind of balance. They had to. The church did not offer clear rules. Instead, it offered contrasts. St. Francis refused to bathe, yet kissed lepers clean. Nuns wept with shame if they glimpsed their reflection, yet braided one another's hair with care. Monks denounced perfume, yet kept their vestments meticulously washed. The lesson seemed to be this: physical comfort is not evil, but it must never become your goal. And so peasants learned to live with restraint, to wash only when it helped the sick, to oil the skin when it cracked, to wear scent only when scent covered decay. They didn't ask for more. They didn't expect baths like the nobles or scented cloths like the merchants. They scrubbed what they could, hid what they couldn't, and endured the rest. Yet even within this restraint, there were quiet rebellions. A boy who scraped soapwort root into his wash bucket before church, though no one asked him to. A woman who burned lavender in the hearth before her husband returned from the fields. An old man who rubbed mint on his chest before burial. Not for pride, not for show, just to feel more human. Because at the heart of it all, the medieval peasant was still a person. One who longed not to stink. One who wanted a moment of freshness, of relief, of something more than dirt and cloth and labor. The idea that cleanliness was a threat to the soul clashed constantly with the daily need to wipe away sweat, to wash off sickness, to anoint a wound. Over time, the church's teachings softened, not formally, but quietly in practice. Priests stopped scolding the old women who brought sage to mass. Monks bathed the dying without comment. Stories of saints grew more human, still holy, but less severe. The idea that God could be found in a clean room, a washed face, a sweet scent, this began to grow. And in your village, that meant the little things. Hanging clothes in the wind, not just to dry but to freshen. Steeping marjoram in the cooking pot, not just for flavor but for fragrance. Dabbing vinegar on cracked hands and calling it healing, not indulgence. These were not sins. These were survival. These were small, sacred gestures made not out of vanity but out of care. You press the thyme cloth to your cheek now, the warmth fading. The smell is nearly gone. You'll hang it near the hearth to dry. It will be used again. Maybe for the baby's feet, maybe for your husband's neck, maybe not until the week's end. But you'll save it, because it matters. Because clean doesn't have to mean sinful, and dirty doesn't always mean holy. Because maybe, just maybe, the saints weren't loved for their filth. But despite it, maybe holiness isn't in how often you wash or how rarely. Maybe it's in why you do it, whether you clean to show off or to comfort. whether you suffer to seek attention or to lift someone else. And as the fire crackles low and your hands grow still, you think, the door creaks open with your shoulder. You step into the one-room cottage, arms full of kindling, and pause. The air is still, heavy with the scent of yesterday's stew and the fine dust of the dirt floor. A faint trickle of wind presses through the cracks in the wall, curling around the beams. You set the wood down beside the hearth and take a moment to look around. The table leans slightly to one side. The pots are stacked near the corner. Ash clings to everything. And yet, this is clean. Or at least, as clean as any peasant home in the 1200s ever was. In the medieval world, cleanliness didn't mean absence of dirt. It meant control of it. Peasant homes, built from wattle and daub or rough stone, often had packed earth floors that couldn't be swept in the way modern ones can. Instead, they were raked with stiff brooms made of bound twigs, which lifted bits of straw, ash, and scraps from the surface. The goal wasn't to make the floor spotless. It was to remove anything that might attract rats or insects, or make walking unpleasant. Ashes from the hearth were spread across the floor deliberately, not just for warmth, but because ash helped dry the ground, soak up moisture, and reduce odors. Sometimes, crushed mint or sweet woodruff was mixed in, releasing faint scent when walked upon. Even here, in a place most would call filthy, that was intent. The walls, often whitewashed or left bare, grew darker with each passing season. Soot from the hearth climbed up toward the thatched roof, leaving long black trails. The rafters above gathered cobwebs, but these too had a purpose. Some believed they kept flies away, others simply accepted them. A clean house was not one without cobwebs. It was one where they didn't fall into the food. Linen was the one thing you truly scrubbed. You pulled the coarse shirts, shifts, and kerchiefs from their hooks, carried them to the nearest stream or barrel, and scrubbed them on boards or stones using lye soap. The lye came from ash, boiled down, filtered, and mixed with animal fat to make a caustic cleanser. Harsh on the skin, but effective on cloth. After scrubbing, the fabric was rinsed, wrung out, and hung to dry on hedges or from the eaves of the cottage. You washed linen on the quarter days, or when the dirt grew too visible to ignore. Underclothes and baby cloths more often. But outerwear, sometimes only a few times a year. It was too labor-intensive and too cold much of the time. You didn't have enough garments to spare. Pots were another story. Iron or clay, they needed constant attention. Food burned quickly. Soot clung to the outsides. After every meal, you scraped them with a wooden paddle or straw bundle, then rinsed with water from the barrel. When needed, you boiled ash and poured it inside to lift grease. The residue was scoured out with sand or crushed eggshells. No one would have called it sterile, but it was practical. In wealthier homes, rushes were strewn on the floor and mixed with herbs. In yours, rushes were rare, saved for when guests arrived or during birthings. Otherwise, you laid woven mats of reed or scrap cloths near the hearth to kneel on. You wiped the benches when they stuck. You beat the straw mattresses with sticks when they grew too full of dust or bugs. Cleaning wasn't daily. It was periodic, tied to the rhythms of feast days, births, deaths, or visits from the reeve. When the parish priest came for blessing, when the midwife was due, or when your mother-in-law threatened to stop by, that's when you truly cleaned. But every morning, you still swept. Every night, you still checked the pot. You pulled back the cloth from the bread to check for mold. You tapped the roof beams to loosen the soot so it wouldn't fall in your bowl. And when something stank beyond endurance, you burned herbs or pine needles to mask the scent. You remember one winter when a rat died in the wall. You couldn't reach it. The smell lasted a month. You burned dried rosemary daily, weeping from the smoke. But you endured, because there was no other way. So here, in your soot-darkened home, with a dirt floor and linen stiff from washing, you still feel a kind of pride. You know every corner. You know which board creaks, which hook is strongest, which place to set. the bucket so it doesn't tip. You know how to scrape grease from wood, how to draw warmth from the hearth, how to scrub cloth until it steams. This is your space. This is your care made visible. And as you light a stub of tallow candle and glance, again at the ash-streaked walls, you wonder, when did we decide that a clean home must be spotless, when once it only needed to be livable? You lift the lid of the water barrel and peer inside. The surface ripples faintly. It's half full. Enough to clean the porridge pot, maybe rinse the baby's cloth, but not enough for the floorboards or tunics. You tip the ladle, careful not to stir the murky sediment at the bottom. That's where the insects sometimes collect. A few beetles float near the rim. You flick them out with your finger and pour. Water was at the center of every peasant household's cleaning efforts, but always in short supply. Wells, if your village had one, were reserved for drinking. Washing water came from barrels filled with rain or carried from streams. In summer, it evaporated or spoiled. In winter, it froze. Either way, it was precious. No one wasted it. You learned to reuse wash water, the first pour for laundry, the second for cleaning pots, the final rinse for the floor or the pigs. Lye and ashes helped. After you scooped them from the hearth and sifted out the coals, you'd soak the powder in. Warm water for hours. It turned cloudy and sharp. You didn't need much, just enough to loosen grease or lift a stain. You rubbed it into cloth with stiff fingers, then beat the garment against a stone to drive it in. Too much lye, and the fabric wore thin. Too little, and the filth stayed. Finding the balance was knowledge passed down quietly, from mother to daughter. On wash days, you boiled linens in the iron pot, poking them with a stick to keep them from scalding. The heat killed lice and softened the fibers. A sharp scent filled the house. Fat, ash, steam. You opened the door, let the smoke drift out. Cleanliness didn't smell fresh. It smelled like effort. The idea of a clean home was not visual. It wasn't about spotless walls or polished wood. It was about function. No visible mold on the bread shelf. No foul stench from the bedding. No grease thick enough to catch flies. A peasant woman kept her home clean not because of pride, but because a dirty house bred sickness, and sickness meant death. There were rituals to it. Not religious exactly, but repeated in the same rhythm each week or season. Monday, you scraped soot from the hearth. Wednesday, you turned the straw in the mattress. Saturday, you checked the roof for leaks and the corners for droppings. Each job had its time. Each job kept your family safe. Tools were simple: a stiff broom, a strip of old linen for scrubbing, a wooden paddle to beat rugs or push cloth in the wash pot. Soap was rare and used sparingly. More often, you used sand to scour, vinegar to freshen, or herbs to disguise. You'd line the bed with wormwood to chase fleas. You'd hang lavender or marjoram to soften the scent of wool. And when things were beyond saving, you burned them. Old straw, spoiled rags, infested sacks. The chimney smoked thick when you did that. The smell carried. Neighbors sometimes paused outside to sniff. Not with judgment, but with understanding. Everyone knew that cleanliness came in waves when time, water, and weather allowed. Children helped when they could. Boys hauled water or stirred the pot. Girls swept or picked over the washing stones for soapwort. They learned by doing. They didn't question the rhythm of it until someone visited. A reeve or priest, perhaps. That's when the broom swept, twice. That's when cloths were hung neatly and the hearth swept down to glowing embers. You remember one such day. Your cousin came with her new husband, a man from 3 villages over. You spent the entire morning scrubbing the bench with vinegar, boiling your only 2 shirts, burning dried herbs for the smell. He still wrinkled his nose when he walked in, said nothing, but you saw it. And you thought, he doesn't know how many hours clean takes, because that was the truth of it. A clean house was not the absence of dirt, it was the constant labor of managing it, of lifting filth only to have it return, of never winning but never giving up. A kind of slow domestic endurance that rarely drew praise and never ended, and yet you kept doing it, because when the hearth was swept and the linen steamed, when the pot no longer smelled of old onions, when your children laid down on a bed that didn't crawl, you felt peace, not pride, not satisfaction, just a moment of calm in a world full of chaos. And you wonder, if the measure of cleanliness is not what others see, but how safely you can sleep, then who decides what it means to be truly clean? The rain starts mid-morning, soft at first, then steady. You step back into the cottage, holding your shawl closed at the neck, feet squelching in the doorway. The roof doesn't leak today. You glance up, grateful. Last winter, water dripped through the thatch and soaked the bench by the fire. It took 3 days to dry the straw mattress. You had scrubbed the mildew from the floor with vinegar, breathing through your sleeve. That smell, bitter, sharp, clean, still clings in memory. The smell of a battle you won. Cleaning was never an event. It was a background motion, a habit that filled the cracks between every other task. You stirred porridge and scraped pots. You changed a cloth and wiped a bench. You raked ash, turned straw, drew water. No one praised you. No one noticed, unless you stopped. Hearths blackened quickly. Floors gathered debris. Cloths stained fast. It was not negligence. It was inevitability. You didn't aim for perfection. You aimed for order, for a home that would not make someone sick, for a bed that didn't bite, for a corner of quiet in the middle of mud and smoke. Over time, you found small victories. A clay pot repaired with pitch that still held water. A smoothed board you could sit on without splinters. Linen that smelled faintly of time when hung near the fire. These were not riches, but they were yours. And they were clean in the only way that mattered. The elders told stories, sometimes, of how their mothers cleaned, with nettle and moss, how they boiled rags in cauldrons, how they scrubbed blood from cloth after births and bruises. You listened, not to learn something new, but to remember you weren't alone. Your work was old, your labor part of a line. And though it wore you down, it also made you feel anchored. There was beauty too, though it went unnoticed. The way soot feathered across beams like a painted wash. The rhythm of a broom against the floor. The steam curling up from hot linen on a cold day. The hiss of damp wood catching fire, chasing the wet from the air. No one called it beautiful, but you saw it. You felt it in your bones. Once a year, sometimes less, a nobleman's steward might pass through, inspecting cottages, noting repairs. You always tidied harder on those days, swept ash more thoroughly, hid stained cloths, aired out the straw. But you did not do it for him. You did it for the moment he left, when the house was clean and no one would disturb it, and you could sit down and exhale. Cleanliness did not come from soap. It came from persistence, from knowing which bucket to use, which rag to burn, when to let go, from making do, from starting over again and again without complaint, from believing that your efforts made a difference, even if the dirt always came back. Now, as you sit by the hearth, hands wrapped around a bowl of warm broth, you glance at the corner of the room where sunlight breaks through the smoke hole. Dust dances in the light. You don't wipe it away. It will settle again tomorrow, and you'll sweep again tomorrow. That's what it means to keep a home. You sip slowly and wonder. If no one remembers the soot you wiped or the rags you boiled, does the care still count? You wake early on the appointed morning, heart tight with nerves, even though no words have been spoken. It is the day before your betrothal. The women in your family have already begun their work. Your mother heats the kettle over the hearth. Your older sister lays out the linen cloth. Your aunt sorts herbs in a wooden bowl. There is no feast, no dancing. Not yet. First, you must be scrubbed. Not just for your health, not just for appearance, but because this bath is tradition. In the medieval village, most peasants didn't bathe often, but there were exceptions, and one of the most anticipated was the pre-marriage bath. It was less a ritual of indulgence and more a necessity, long expected but rarely discussed.